30,000 subscribers. That's an insane number. I never thought I would hit anything near that. Not to say that I don't think I make good videos or have good content or whatnot, but I just didn't think I would be good enough at social media. I was just making the videos purely for myself or for anybody that might happen to fall into the same traps in the fitness industry that I fell into. I was making it for me and for them, for a very niche community, and to be able to discover and realize the community that was out there that needed to hear a voice similar to mine. It's an honor for me to be able to be that person, and I appreciate you guys coming to me for training philosophy, methods, and my own perspective. So I really do appreciate it. I wouldn't be able to do what I do without the community, without you guys, so I have a lot of people to thank, and as corny as all that might sound, it's also the truth, so it needed to be said. With all that being said, today's video, as you could probably tell by the title, or if you saw my community post on YouTube or my story on Instagram, I'm doing basically just a mega Q&A. I'm pretty sure it's over 200 questions, if not like 300 plus, or maybe even closer to 400 between YouTube and Instagram. So I'm going to do my best to go through them. I want to get through all of them. There are going to be a handful that I won't be able to. If you ask me to like review your program or give like constructive criticism on like a more in-depth detailed training split or something like that, I just won't be able to do it because I don't have the time or energy to do that in this specific video. So it's going to be probably pretty much rapid fire. A few questions that I think are more interesting, I might go more in depth on those, but either way, with all that being said, let's get right to it. So first question, thoughts on new evidence suggesting preacher curl is a better brachialis builder but not biceps. So there was the study that Menno Henselmans posted on his Instagram. He posted a whole kind of like review and almost was just kind of communicating the details of the study, at least that we have to this point, comparing incline curls versus preacher curls. And as far as I know, or at least to my knowledge, they were on untrained lifters. And sometimes the tricky part with a study like this is, or a study where you're using untrained lifters, is it's very hard to standardize a lot of things, and the beginners are much weaker, obviously, than a trained individual, and you might say, oh, it doesn't really matter, weight's weight, but it also, as I've detailed in the past, greatly changes the stability requirements or demands of any lift that you're doing. Like if you're a beginner and you're curling 10-pound pink dumbbells, you don't really need much external stability, but if you're someone like me and you can rep out like 135 pounds on a barbell, then a preacher curl is going to become a clear, better decision at that strength level. So you can see how while like a preacher versus an incline curl might not have much of a difference for a beginner, or maybe it favors the incline curl because they're newbies getting their stretch-mediated hypertrophy from an incline curl where you're stretching your biceps, even with a little tension. I could see how in the short term for a new lifter that would be the better play, but if we're talking about like 98% of your actual gains and of your actual lifting career, I would say a preacher curl would be the better option. But to get back to the actual question, I would need to see a lot more science and a lot more evidence that the preacher curl is a better brachialis builder than a bicep builder. I can definitely see how it would grow the brachialis really nicely because it is obviously, you're still training elbow flexion, but I think just anecdotally with myself, obviously I can't represent every single person because everybody has slightly different leverages in their elbow flexors or across their entire body. But I would say with all the evidence that we have that biceps are better leveraged, or they have better leverage when you're training them at longer lengths, the preacher curl makes a ton of sense, and it could still be an excellent brachialis builder, but I don't think there's enough evidence to refute its benefits towards the actual biceps themselves. So I think we still need to see a little bit more, but I'm definitely very open-minded to it being a really good brachialis builder too. Next question from Untamed Strength. What up, Alan? For many, bodybuilding is tough due to time constraints. What is your minimal 3-day-a-week 60-minute routine? So if you're talking about actual splits, I would just do full body. And what I would do is train your high priorities with a different variation each time. So if you're doing 3 times a week and let's say triceps are a very high priority, I would do like an incline push down one day and overhead extension the next day, and then on the final day maybe something like a Smith JM press. And what happens with this is you get to train the tricep as a whole each time, but it biases different parts or different functions or different ranges of motion of the tricep in each session, and those all kind of start to like complement each other, and you start to build a little bit of momentum in your training routine. If you have a slightly lower priority, full body's kind of the way to go too, because you can indirectly hit a lot of muscle groups by just using compound movements intelligently. So if you take something like a let's say a barbell row or like a Pendlay row, either one, kind of depends how you do it. That's a really good way to get a little bit of hamstring stimulus to make sure that your hamstring curls that you're doing once a week work really well. Because let's say you just do hamstring curls once a week, you're kind of just spinning your wheels. Like, you create a stimulus on day 1, and then you don't train them the day 2 and the day 3 on your program, and now you're back at it again a week later. You're only doing 2 or 3 sets a week total, and you just don't have the frequency to just keep that stimulus going before the muscle starts to kind of lose those adaptations. If you were to do like a Pendlay or a barbell row on day 2 or day 3, now you have a good stimulus you're making on day 1 with the hamstring curl, and then on day 2 or 3 when you do the Pendlay or barbell row, you have enough to at least keep it treading water, and then you can keep building on that next day. The last thing you want to do with full body is just not train a muscle for like 2 of those sessions. So what I would try and do is find ways to indirectly hit each muscle, and then for your prime muscles that you're trying to grow, make sure they each have their own slots, and try and sneak other muscles in there in little ways. So same thing could go for, like, let's say triceps. Like, I'm not a huge fan of the close grip bench or dips for building the triceps specifically, but if you're doing one of those movements on one of your days, you can cancel out a tricep slot and just let them tread water or slowly grow on those kinds of days. So you have to kind of like almost think outside of the box a little bit, and I actually think programming full body, that's kind of the most fun it gets, in my opinion. What's your guilty pleasure? I would say Fortnite Bed Wars, even though I get sniped every time, and people are just too good at sniping now. It's so fun. What's the best part of a s'more? Roasting it. I think it's fun. No, I would say this. I would say the marshmallow. I love s'mores. I love like chocolate and that kind of stuff. I'm not huge on like fruity sweets or anything. Like, I'm not against them, but yeah, like if I was to get ice cream, I like to, like, if I was to get a Blizzard from Dairy Queen, it's gonna have like Oreos, cookie dough, like all that kind of stuff. M&Ms. Volume versus intensity for arms. How to program arms into a powerlifting routine. So what I would do is, if you have a powerlifting routine, just take the exact template you have now, and wherever it says low bar squat, just change it to preacher curls. In all seriousness, what I would do is focus on intensity. Intensity is going to be key for growing the arms, as long as you're training them often enough. Volume does tend to be overrated, especially when you're using very precise lifts. Like, if you're doing a preacher curl and you're locked in on that pad and you're training extremely hard, you just don't need a bunch of sets to make up for any lack of stability or lack of overall stimulus, so you just don't require a ton of volume. So what I would do is just have very good, very fundamentally sound form on excellent, like airtight exercise selection, and you pretty much should be good. If you're talking about getting them into a powerlifting routine, it just comes down to your split. I mean, powerlifting, all you really have to do is squat, bench, and deadlift. None of those are going to interfere with your arm training really at all. You can make a case for bench and triceps a little bit, but I wouldn't worry too much about it, especially if you're using a huge arch and your ROM's really limited anyways. So I would just train arms on whatever your easier days are in your program, where you have a little bit more time or at least more energy, and just kind of train them like how you would for anything else. Train them twice a week, pick a bicep and a tricep lift, a variation for one session over the other, and you're pretty much good to go. I wouldn't overthink it. Especially if you're newer to training arms, you'll get a pretty good amount of growth quickly from just training them properly. Is training twice a week full body good for recreational natty lifters who are busy working life? Yes, I would say it is. Training twice a week full body, like I said, if you do it properly, it works really well. I used to be kind of against full body when I was a beginner, because I still thought the pump was going to be super important for growth, and I was like, well, if I'm dispersing the pump all across my body, then how can I grow that well? And once you kind of see past that, full body's like, oh, and that's kind of why it works. Sun LB, so that must mean Sunday lower body, Monday upper body arm emphasis, Thursday lower body, Friday upper body shoulder emphasis. Thanks. Yeah, that's fine. Do novices need to fiddle with volume, or is a moderate approach good enough? So, yeah, you can mess around with volume a little bit. If volume is not a very important variable when you're a beginner, what I would focus more on is intensity, technique, and frequency. When you're a novice, you just can't create that much of or you at least can't create that much fatigue, and that opens the door for frequency. So your recovery is very minimal, and your skill is going to be low. So the more often you can practice training a certain lift or a muscle, the quicker and faster you can make gains. So frequency is going to be key. Focus on training hard and focus on technique. So intensity and technique, those are very correlated in my opinion. And what I kind of umbrella that under is called precision. You want to increase your training precision the most you can, and once you find that you're unable to recover and you're moving a bunch of heavy weight and your muscles are much bigger, then good problem to have. You're an intermediate, and just learn how to properly program as an intermediate from there. Which noble natty has, in your opinion, the best physique? Are you serious? It's obviously me. No, I would say the best physique out of like the noble natty content creators, it is tough because I think everybody looks a lot different. So from like an objective from like a subjective bodybuilding perspective, it's really hard to say. I would say the overall best physique, just from my personal opinion, I would probably say Jeff. Bald Man has a great physique. His back is insane. His arms are insane too. Alex Leonidas is great. Just all around jacked, especially now that his arms are much bigger. His back's out of this world, same with his pecs. Natural hypertrophy, he's well-rounded. He's up there too. Arms are massive. Legs are massive. I would say I have the best upper body proportions though. I don't think I'm the biggest, but I do think I have the best proportions. Overall, I'd give it to Jeff. Opinion on high-frequency full-body training. This is super popular. I really like it. When you say high-frequency, if you're talking about more than the usual recommendation of 2 to 3 times a week, so if you're talking like 4, 5, 6 times a week where you're guaranteed to be having back-to-back sessions, I don't have enough first-hand experience with that to give you an actual answer. I would say it definitely can work, and it is something I'm open-minded to experimenting with, but I can't comment further until then. It would just be disingenuous. So how deep should you go on a dumbbell shoulder press? I would just go to slightly below peak resistance, so just below, parallel with the upper arm to the floor, and you should probably be fine. You can definitely get deeper and get more to less weight, but I would reserve that for the more advanced guys that are like using an intensity technique, or not an intensity, but an advanced technique to get more out of less weight. It's a higher skill lift to go super low and know exactly where you need to go. For anyone up to like the mid-intermediate stage, just go right to below peak resistance, get through the most challenging portion of the lift. Don't worry about the deep stretch. There's less tension down there. You don't know what you're doing down there until you are more advanced and just have a better idea of not only your own feeling of training, but also just understanding anatomy and biomechanics more. What I would do is just go right below peak resistance, head right back up, let the dumbbells come out nice and wide so you're not getting a ton of tricep action there, and you should pretty much be good. If you were a 19 to 20-year-old guy that had been lifting since 14 years old, will you still bulk at 19? Yeah, of course, as long as your body fat's reasonable. It looks like this guy did a multi-part question, but they're not in the right order, so I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer that one. I apologize. Next one, what do you think about Jonathan Warren's advice for bench press techniques? So, yeah, I mean, he's like an OG bro. I love it. For those that don't know, his advice for bench technique is to not use an arch. You want to make sure that your rib cage can kind of like stay strong and fully expand. If you start to arch your back a ton, it compresses your rib cage from the back. What I would say is his advice makes a lot of sense. Emphasizing scapular depression makes a ton of sense too. Your pecs are very similar to your lats, where they like to wrap around your rib cage, and if your rib cage is popped up way too much, your pecs kind of just sitting behind your ribs. Same thing for if your shoulders and your scap start to elevate. Now you can even feel that your pec isn't going to be able to leverage that rib cage since it's now sitting more above it. Your rib cage is more down here. So keep your scaps down, let your pec stretch right around the rib cage, and it makes a ton of sense. And allow for protraction too. I think this is something that Cassim Hansen also nailed. He has a very good in-depth video. It's about 20 or 25 minutes. He doesn't really give any practical advice or takeaways in it, but he just kind of explains that you do need protraction to some degree in your pressing if you want to avoid shoulder injury. And I'm somebody that has had inflamed AC joints in the past, likely from just emphasizing too much of scapular retraction. So actually allowing for more protraction, I haven't had the AC joint inflammation or pain or discomfort since I watched Cassim's video. So I think they both nail it. And I think they both have pretty reasonable takes with it too, where it's like, that's not like the biomechanics secret to unlocking a bunch of gains, but it just makes sense. You can do whatever you want to do, and that's a very efficient way. Even if you are weaker, it just makes sense biomechanically. So I love that take. Next question, how much does alcohol affect you as an intermediate? Do you have to give it up to make progress? No, you don't have to give it up. You just have to focus on the most exciting thing in the world, which is moderation. Moderation is key. I would just avoid drinking excessively on the days before you lift, especially if you're lifting in the morning. I mean, just for me personally, like, I'll usually drink once a week, sometimes not even once a week, but I'd say on average, yeah, maybe once a week. Like if I'm hanging out with friends or my brother, or I go out to dinner or something, I'll have a couple beers, nothing crazy. Like, if you're getting drunk to the point where you're hungover, that's a problem. But if you're not drinking enough to get hungover, I know it's a very vague kind of general concept, you're probably fine as long as you're not drinking too often. So I wouldn't worry about ditching alcohol, but yeah, I would say try and limit it. Just be reasonable like anybody else. Do you think a person's wrist measurement is important for their max arm size? Maybe. There's probably correlation with it, but I wouldn't say that like a giant arm size with a small wrist is like a rare exception. Like I do think there's probably a general correlation. I think someone with a skinnier wrist is just more likely to have a shorter wingspan or just be shorter overall, and obviously your overall size as a person is going to change what your arms read in at. Like Jeffrey Verity Schofield, the only reason his arms are bigger than mine is because he's taller than me. No, obviously I'm kidding, but yeah, I do think there's going to be some correlation, but I wouldn't take that as like a general rule. Don't limit yourself in that way when it's not conclusive enough. Gaining weight but losing reps on specific bicep exercises, what could be the problem? Losing reps, I mean, there could be a bunch of different reasons for that. I would say you could be, aside from the obvious ones, like your sleep sucks, your diet sucks, your programming isn't good, you're just not recovered for each session. Like, those are things that we all know to kind of keep an eye out for. At least it's just advice that you'll hear the most, or in pretty much any video about losing strength or something. It could be, if you're actively making your technique better, you are going to lose strength on paper. And this is something that people just don't talk about enough. There's a lot of people that have like crazy progressive overload strength type related anxiety, and they're afraid to improve their technique because it's going to result in strength loss. So if you are actively making your technique better, it does make the lift harder when you're going for max stimulus, and that could be a reason for losing strength. So what I would do is try and standardize everything as much as possible, and that will give you a very clear sight into how your progression is going. So if you pick a lift like a preacher curl, that's a very standardizable, consistent, stable, trackable lift. I would see how it goes from there. If you're gaining weight and you are losing strength, you're probably not training hard enough. That would be my guess, but I would need way more context to give a real answer there. What are you recommending glute exercises? Are sumo squats overhyped for glutes versus regular squats? Yeah, I wouldn't do a sumo squat, but what I would do for glutes is Romania deadlifts, leg press is going to be great, and low bar squats. All excellent exercises, and that's how I built my glutes. Although not from leg press, because I thought it was a machine and I would be weak if I used a leg press, or at least took it seriously. What do you do for stalled muscle groups? Some personal examples. So if a muscle group is stalled, you have to figure out if it's a lagging muscle group or if it's a stubborn muscle group. So if it's stalled and it's a stubborn muscle group, meaning you've tried everything that is the quote-unquote by the book way to train and it still isn't growing, I would just add I would make sure your frequency is good, and I would make sure you have enough variety. So I'd make sure you're training as many different functions and regions of the muscle as you possibly can without being just within reason, obviously. I just covered this in one of my recent videos too, so take a look at my older video, not older videos, my recent videos for that. I'm trying to remember what the title was. It was like, so you hit a plateau, now what? I'll answer that question in that video, much more in depth than I could here. Home gym leg press alternative. It's not going to be a whole ton. I can't really think of any. So I would say for a typical leg press and with a typical moderate technique, a low bar squat's going to be comparable, but now you have all that axial loading, so it changes the lift a lot. But as far as like quad to hip ratio goes, it's going to be pretty comparable. But I would say, yeah, there's not going to be a whole ton. A Smith machine's a really good way to get a nice stable, lower overall axial loading compared to a barbell squat. So if you have a Smith machine, that could be a good one. You can do like a Smith hack squat or a Smith high bar squat, where you can really emphasize tracking the knees for, like a Platt style squat, without having to worry about balancing a barbell on your back. So that's what I'd say. Other than that, it's going to be very, very tough. I had a couple people send in screenshots, Jim, kind of at that point now. So this guy says, not a question, but a take, and I'd love your opinion on this. We science-based are not small because we're science-based, but we're science-based because we are small. Truth is, if we train like the average bro or bodybuilder, we'd have no results at all, and most of them would have better results if they trained more intelligently. So, yeah, I for the most part agree with that, but I wouldn't say, if you just trained like everybody else, or you trained like a bodybuilder, like a general bodybuilder with good genetics, generally speaking, you will at least get some results. Like if you train as hard as those guys do, no matter how bad your programming is, like within some kind of reason, you will still get results. It will just be, you will have a lot of like stubborn or lagging muscle groups that are not good looking. So you see those guys that can get away with training like a power lifter, power builder, and they're like shredded and have these crazy aesthetic physiques. Those guys are the genetic freaks. I thought I could do that, and then I had like tiny little arms, no calves, tiny quads, even though I had all these big numbers. I was all lats and delts. So, and a lot of glutes and hamstrings. Not a whole ton of hamstrings, but a lot of glutes. So, I would say, kind of. You're kind of right, but you if you're not getting any results, then you're probably just not training hard enough. Next one, another screenshot here from, actually from a different person, kind of funny timing. Hi man, new to your channel, new to working out as well. Just wanted to know whether I need to count my reps or not while performing unilateral exercises if I'm following your philosophy. Progressive overload is an outcome. Yeah, I would definitely still track them. Is tendon damage for biceps that common for naturals, or was it just overrepresented? Tendon damage, yeah, I mean, you can get nagging elbow pain from just not having balanced bicep or tricep training, or just overdoing it with the volume, intensity, and frequency. So just general programming overkill. But it's not something I would worry about. Just program reasonably, and you should be fine. I would just kind of start small and see how you grow on seemingly low amounts of work, and then add stuff as you start to stall out as far as growth goes. How can I work on rib cage expansion for a vacuum? I mean, if the old school guys are right, breathing pullovers and breathing squats, but I'm on the fence about it. I just don't know. I'm not closed-minded to it, but I'm not entirely open-minded to rib cage expansion being a thing. Who knows? Last set to failure for compounds. Compounds is too vague of a term for that recommendation. So what I would say is on lengthened biased compound movements like presses and squat patterns, you do not need or even want to go to failure. 0 RAR is a really good target. 1 RIR on a lot of those are fine as well. But if you're talking about like a seated cable row, absolutely take it to failure. It's still a compound movement. So I'd say on compound pulls that are short biased, yeah, probably go to failure. Compound presses that are lengthened biased, don't really need to. When do you deload? When you're a powerlifter. Favorite soda? Bud Heavy. Heck yeah, dude. Full body 3 times a week enough. Another full body one. Yeah, it is. Yeah, full body 3 times a week. It really is a solid way to train. It's not a conventional, like, competitive bodybuilder's way of training for the most part, but it really is a valid way to train as long as you know what you're doing. I've made mistakes programming full body too, where I try and get every little variation of the entire body every session. That's not a good way to train because your focus is just spread out across everywhere. It turns into a quantity over quality thing, and the key is just to strike that balance, get your quantity and variety throughout the week, and get the quality and the intensity during the sessions, and you should be good. Thoughts on people making more overall progress with bodybuilding training than powerlifting? Yeah, you will. Overall progress is in terms of muscle growth and general strength. Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The only reason why powerlifting works for certain people is because if someone is very numbers oriented, then that gives them an incentive to stay consistent or train hard. Like, objectively speaking, if you kind of take that emotion or, like, mental side out of it, bodybuilding, like, on paper and objectively, I do think is a much better way to train for strength and for size. Because that's what bodybuilding is. It's building each muscle up as much as you possibly can. Powerlifting will opt for short-term displays of strengths over that long-term progression and adaptation. How far can simple double progression take you strength-wise? Proper way to program it. Yeah, you don't. The thing is, you don't need to program it. It can take you. I mean, it can take you pretty far. Like, if you're talking double progression with no other variables manipulated, like without changing your frequency or volume, it can take you pretty far somewhere in the intermediate stage, and then you have to start tweaking other variables. But you can always rely on double progression to be your main source of long-term progressive overload, like until you're at your limit, I would say. Bald Omni-Man / Mike Azertel likes cambered bar. Thoughts? Yeah, cambered bar is solid. Lets you get a little more range of motion. If you can handle it, go for it. Yeah, I have nothing against the cambered bar. What is / are the best alternatives to the Smith JM press for tricep growth? Certain selectorized machine dips are pretty good. It's not going to be perfect. It's going to be a little more pecs than a regular Smith JM press, especially with the slightly wider grip and the less overall ROM and the less ability to control where your bar path is. But you can do a lot of good stuff with body weight. So if you just take your regular JM press grip width, so shoulder joint width like this, you can just do push-ups off of a box. You can do them off the floor. You can do them weighted. You can do them off of a racked barbell. Like that. That's a pretty good way to mimic a JM press, I would say, because everything else is just going to mess with your stability and your resistance profile. So if you're looking for something that can mimic those, which are the benefits of the JM press, I would just say do it body weight or with weighted calisthenics. How do you deal with elbow pain? I don't really get elbow pain, so I couldn't give you. I wouldn't be the right. Not that I couldn't give you a generic basic solution to it, but I'm not the guy to ask because that's not something I deal with. I'd love to see a nutrition protocol vid, i.e. pre, intra, post, macro balancing, etc. I personally think all that stuff is very overrated, especially when I started training fasted in the morning and didn't notice any discrepancy in my strength. Even when I stopped taking pre-workout, was yawning between every set, getting less sleep. Like, I just don't think it's that big of a deal. I would say it's one of those things where everybody's going to respond a little bit differently. So what I would do is just, if you notice a benefit with certain meal timing or eating certain foods at a certain time of day or day of the week or whatever, before or after training or whatever, it's one of those things where you're probably going to have to experiment with it yourself. I have found in my own personal experimentation that it just doesn't really matter that much. Feel like tendons are quote-unquote tight on the outside of my elbows. I'm not going to be able to give you a proper answer for that. Injury stuff, unless you're a client of mine, like, I just don't have enough context. What keeps you motivated to train? Not much, really not much. I wouldn't say I'm that motivated, and that might be the wrong thing to say as like a content creator, but it's the truth. Like, I'm really not that motivated. There are times where I just like, I'm motivated out of the love of bodybuilding, just because I enjoy the process as a whole. I love results. I love feeling jacked. I love looking jacked. I love seeing my measurements go up. That's pretty much it. But I'm really not that motivated of a person. Like, in my first year of training, absolutely. Like, I would get butterflies in my stomach before going to the gym. Like, I was obsessed. Not in like a compulsive, like, addiction, love-hate relationship kind of way. Like, I genuinely enjoyed it so much. Like, it is all I wanted to do, and I was just so happy and satisfied, and I just loved lifting. And obviously it starts to become more mundane as you go, just because it becomes part of your routine. You're used to doing it for so long. So what I've actually been doing is switching to lower frequency training sessions, and I have been doing for a kind of a long time at this point, an upper lower upper workout split. So I've only been training 3 days a week, and what that's done is it's let me have enough days off to crave getting back into the gym, so I just enjoy my training more without it being at the expense of my gains. So what I'm doing now is I'm actually just switching over to a 3 times a week full body split and just kind of sprinkling in that leg work like I talked about at the beginning of this Q&A to make sure I get a little bit of leg stimulus, because when I was training upper lower upper, while that can work, I'm at a point where I'm not going to see much progress just training legs once a week. Like, I would need more than that, just because I'm a little bit more advanced overall, even if my legs aren't that great. So if I want to keep growing, I would be better to just do overall less work throughout the week, but keep my frequency a little bit higher than just going and hammering away at legs once a week. So more days off as I've gotten more advanced has been something that I never thought I would do, but has proven to be pretty beneficial, I would say. What's your incline curl PR? I think the most I've hit was 55s for 7 or 8. That was back when my arms were like 16 and a half or so. They weren't really that big, but that's where the correlation between strength and absolute size in terms of like the arm measurement does get a little bit more nuanced, because you can kind of say like me and someone like Jeff had pretty similar incline curl strength. He was always a little bit stronger than me, but his triceps just absolutely blew mine out of the water. So that would add over an inch to his measurement compared to me, even though our biceps were roughly similar strength-wise. So yeah, 55s for 7 or 8. Nothing crazy, but definitely pretty strong. Thoughts on working on a sore muscle group, 2 sets of RDLs on leg day, leave my upper back sore. Yeah, you're probably newer to training, because that should go away pretty quickly. As you start to train with higher frequency, soreness just completely dissipates in my experience with myself and training people. So I would say stick it out for now. You should be fine. It's not going to be enough stimulus to the upper back doing RDLs, so you should be good to just do your upper back work the next day. And the soreness will dissipate within weeks or months at most. Will you film a full-length leg session? I just want to see you perform rack pulls. So no, because I'm not doing leg days anymore, as I just said, and rack pulls I haven't been doing for a long time at this point. I do really like rack pulls, and I do think they're overhated. But right now I'm doing SLDLs and power shrugs for my upper back. The SLDLs are not for upper back, let me make that clear. The power shrugs are. The SLDLs are for the erectors and the glutes and the hamstrings. Next question. How often should I switch exercises for body parts to ensure I still get gains? There's no answer to that. I would just make sure that you're growing, so make sure that you are seeing measurement increases, and make sure that you're seeing strength gains with standardized technique, and that means you're growing. As far as how often you should change, it just depends on the function and the region of the muscle that you're training. If you're training a muscle that's very straightforward, doesn't have a whole ton of regions or functions, then you can get away with less overall variety. If you're training a muscle that has a bunch of different functions and a bunch of different regions, then I would include more variety throughout the week, or be more open to rotation without taking out something that is currently working really well. are contraction-focused movements dead? How can we use them as natty bodybuilders? No, because a lot of muscle groups are going to have good leverage at shorter lengths, and I still think that while a lengthened biased movement will net you overall more growth than a short biased movement, I still think there are certain regions of the muscle that a short biased movement will grow better. So if you were to take, like, say a preacher curl, lengthened biased movement, it's going to train your biceps probably in the more distal region closer to the elbow. It would only make sense that short biased, like, say, elbow supported cable curl or something, will train probably the more proximal region of the bicep. So I think that's I think it's more nuanced than just lengthened versus short biased. And there's also other muscles that have very good leverage, even if it's not a different region of the same muscle. So if you take the biceps and the elbow flexors as a whole, for example, the biceps are probably better leverage to train on something like a preacher curl, where it's more lengthened biased, and it's probably the brachialis and the other elbow flexors that have better leverage to contract up at 90 degrees and higher. So I would still keep variety in. I would still keep lengthened biased movements as the foundation of your program when it's reasonable, but I wouldn't throw out contraction-focused movements, not at all. How do you avoid overuse, injury, and congrats? So I would just make sure you have a balanced approach and you understand biomechanics. If you're training a whole ton of biceps, make sure you're training your triceps properly and efficiently and obviously hard, like you are training your biceps. Include variety as needed too, but most importantly, just make sure everything's more or less balanced in your program in the bigger picture. You can have specialization phases though. Advice for new/small creators in the natty bodybuilding community: yeah, just say what's on your mind and don't be apologetic. Like when I started my channel, a lot of it was unpopular opinions, hot takes, went against the grain. Since then, actually, a lot of what I used to say is kind of more mainstream now. It's probably not all from me, but I have to think some of it is. So say what's on your mind. The last thing you want to do is just repeat what everybody else is saying, because then you don't actually provide value. Not that you don't provide value, because if there's a good message to be said, you can still expand on that message or promote that message even further, and there's nothing wrong with that. And most importantly, just make the content that you want to make. You shouldn't just be making content for the sake of making it. It should be something that you feel like you need to say. So when I knew it was time for me to start my channel, there was a topic that I needed to talk about. It needed to be said because I was sick of nobody talking about it, nobody understanding it, and I felt like I had a calling to say that specific thing. So you have some of those. Don't be afraid to say them. Don't be brainwashed by other people. Just say what you need to say. Make sure it's well thought out and you truly understand it and believe it, and make your content. How do you determine if someone's beginner, intermediate, advanced, etc.? So this one's tough to say because the terms themselves are quite vague. So my approach to this and my perspective on this is a beginner is somebody that can recover super, super easily because they aren't moving a whole ton of weight and they don't know how to train that hard yet. And even if they do know how to train hard, their skill will cap them sooner than what their actual total force output of what they could do in a perfect stable lift would allow them to do. So basically what that means is you aren't able to train to what your capacity is quite yet. Just by nature, you're not going to be able to activate every single muscle fiber within every muscle because you don't have the skill or the mental strength to do that yet in most cases. So beginners are the guys that you'll give them a program and they'll do it with moderate frequency, moderate volume, high intensity, good exercise selection. And they're the guys that will say, I feel like I need to do more. And that's because they are not training hard because they either can't train that hard yet, or they just don't know that they're not actually training that hard yet, or they just are avoiding training hard. So beginners, those are the guys that like rest super short between sets. They're the guys that are always looking to add more volume or do more variety. They're always like, they leave the gym, they're like, oh, I feel like I could do more. So that's typically a beginner. An intermediate is typically somebody that can create recovery issues. So that's somebody that can start to generate nagging pains and injuries over time, not just like a sudden injury from doing something incorrectly, but like you start to get nagging shoulder pain or nagging hip pain or knee pain or something like that. You're starting to be strong enough and you have enough overall size and skill and coordination to hurt yourself. So an intermediate, someone like that. An advanced lifter is somebody that can feel like you've done an entire workout by just doing a couple sets. Your precision is through the roof. You can train absolutely brutally hard, and you're stronger than the vast majority of people. You're pretty much always going to be the strongest guy in your gym. If you're lean, you're going to have, like truly lean, like 15% under, you're going to have 16, 17 inch arms. If you are peak bulk, you're probably going to have 18, 19 or so inch arms. You're going to have better overall looking body fat distribution. You are going to be able to learn new movements very easily, not to perfection, but as a whole, you'll be able to pretty much execute most things properly pretty quickly. And I could go way more in depth on this, but I think that kind of gets the gist of it. How often would you recommend working out forearms, and are wrist curls enough? Wrist curls are, if you're on a general bodybuilding program, wrist curls are what I would prioritize because you're already getting a lot of elbow flexor work. So what I would do is, prioritize the wrist flexors. I would just do wrist curls twice a week, same volume, same variety type as everything else. I'd start off doing 2 of your favorite wrist curl variations or finger curl variations twice a week, 2 to 3 sets each. Super hard training, and you should pretty much be good, at least as a baseline from there. If the forearms are stubborn or something, then of course, you can refer to my other plateau video too, but don't worry about that yet. Best lift for the rhomboid region. It'll just get trained with your traps and lats, so I wouldn't even worry about that. What is your diet like, bulk/cut? So more or less the same between the two. I almost do intermittent fasting when I cut. I just have a super small breakfast, like I'll just have a protein shake or something just to kind of save more calories for lunch and dinner. My overall diet for breakfast, I'll typically have Greek yogurt with fruit and granola, and if I'm bulking, maybe I'll have like a protein bar or something with it. Lunch is typically going to be a smoothie with something else, so I'll do spinach, fruit, soy milk, flaxseed meal, and protein powder and creatine in a smoothie with whatever else I feel like making. Could be like some gnocchi, could be pasta. Could just be something smaller, like a protein bar and cheese and crackers or something if I'm not training that day. Dinner, it depends. Like some of my go-to meals are like chicken with, like sometimes I'll just do pasta and make like a ground chicken meat sauce to put on it. Sometimes I'll do like breaded baked chicken tenders with mashed potatoes and peas or something like that. It's very standard kind of basic stuff. I'm not a foodie. I've said that before. I'll just eat what I need to make gains and be healthy, and I do not overthink it. That's more or less it. And like obviously basic fruits, vegetables, that kind of stuff. How long did it take you to get from 16 to 17 inch arms and 17 to 18? So 16 to 17 inches, that took me, I probably hit 16 inches in 2018, so it was probably about 5 years to go from 16 to 17, and then from 17 to 18 was 6, 7, 8 or 9 months, I want to say. So that's where your average Redditor would call me a fake natty, but in reality, it's like if I had never tapped into proper arm training, it doesn't matter that I'm on my 7th year of training if my previous 4 or 5 years just sucked and weren't focused on arms. So yeah, when you do things properly, yes, you will make gains, and it might be all of a sudden very rapid. Oh, I'm on gear because my arms grew really fast in a short period of time. Doesn't make sense. But yeah, when you train things properly, you will start to grow, especially when they were not done properly before. How much do you weigh these days, and do you still dislike ab training? Yeah, I'm not huge on ab training, but it's not because of the training. It's just because I don't care that much about having abs. Once I have a desire to have abs, which goals kind of fluctuate as you go, I'm sure I will have at some point, then I will suddenly enjoy ab training, even though I'm doing the same monotonous sit up, sit down the whole time. It's just about how much I care about that muscle. That's how I feel about a specific lift. Is how much stimulus am I creating for a positive, a positive adaptation that I want, that I care about, and that makes me like lifts like Smith JM press, preacher curls, where other people think they're boring, dumb isolation lifts. I enjoy them because they cause the adaptations that I want to see. As far as my weight goes, I'm like low 190s, like 191, 192-ish. 5'8" for reference. What advice would you give for shoulder growth to someone with poor shoulder mobility? Overall shoulder mobility won't limit your growth in most cases. Like, you might not be able to behind the neck press, but you should still be able to overhead press even if you have bad mobility. You can do probably any raise. Like, face pulls might get a little bit tricky. Your traps might want to take over on some rear delt work. So what I would focus on is allow your scaps and your shoulders to move freely. When you're doing your presses, try and keep your rib cage down the most you can. You don't want your pecs to take over. You don't want your traps to take over. And what I would do is on your raises, same thing. Keep your rib cage down. My favorite cue is just to think about detaching your shoulder and your shoulder joint from your rib cage. When you're doing a lateral raise, you want to reach out and away, keeping your abs crunched and your rib cage down. Don't let your lats, your traps, your pecs kind of do all that stuff for you. Do the best you can with your mobility. Find resistance profiles that work best for you. So if a standing lateral raise, you feel like it gets really tricky kind of at that top portion, do them unilaterally and lie on a flat bench on your side, and then just do them like this, and that might work better, and you can kind of avoid this where it might get a little bit trickier mobility-wise. So put peak tension somewhere else. Advice for skinny fat Indian with terrible genetics. Oh no. I would be somewhat careful with using the term terrible genetics, just because you probably don't know yet if you are still skinny fat. I'm not denying that there is potential you could have terrible genetics. It's obviously a thing, just like some people have great genetics. Some people genuinely do have terrible genetics. So I would just take your own assessment with a grain of salt. And what I would do is train like anybody else would. Watch the top bodybuilders train, watch the top biggest guys on social media train that are natural, and try and copy them the best you can, at least as far as their technique goes. Your programming will have to be a little bit different, but if you have terrible genetics and you're not like a naturally gifted athlete, or you don't have much experience in terms of athletics in your past, what I would do is train probably a little bit more often. So I have a super old beginner routine that I actually followed when I was like 17 or 18. It was like one of my first videos. If you sort my videos by oldest and scroll all the way down, you'll see my upper-lower split that I would train 6 days a week. So I had that super high frequency, training every muscle 3 times a week. And like I've mentioned a couple times in this video, training a muscle very often when you are still skinny is... It can only benefit you, because you're not generating enough fatigue to need more time off, and you're also allowing yourself to learn how to train that muscle, to learn how to master that specific movement more often than not. And the more you can do it, the better you get at it. Best exercises for triceps, no Smith machines. So a seated easy bar overhead extension on a utility bench where you can lean into the back support and let your elbows go up super high. That's an excellent one. Body weight JM press. Oh, you just said you don't even have a Smith machine. So a barbell JM press. Smith machine JM presses are better, but the barbell JM press is still excellent. It has its own benefits too. Like it's right up there with a Smith machine JM press in my opinion. So I would do a Smith machine JM press and an easy bar seated overhead extension. Other than that, you kind of got your bases covered. I mean, you can do like incline push-down variations, and pullovers are really good. Like a PJR pullover, that's another really good one, where it's like a pullover skull crusher hybrid. And that's pretty much all you need. How to achieve massive delts? Tren? No. Overhead pressing is really great. Lying side raises are great, very standardized way to do an isolation lift, and focus a lot on the rear delts. Like, my biggest mistake in recent years was not training my rear delts that much anymore, and when the rear delts shrunk, my physique looked a lot worse. Now that I've been training my rear delts more, my physique looks way better, just like almost instantaneously. So really focus on the rear delts, really focus on overhead pressing, do some lateral raises, and you should pretty much be good. Most people can probably get away with just good overhead press variations and rear delt work, and add in some lateral raises if they're a very high priority, and you should pretty much be fine. Do you take creatine? I do take creatine. Best split to bring up your arms. There's really no best split to bring up your arms. The split is not going to be very relevant to arm training. So, yeah, I mean, the only thing I would avoid is just doing push-pull legs. Like, just avoid training your triceps after, like, an entire push session, or avoid training your biceps after an entire pull session when they're fatigued but not stimulated enough to grow, and now you're training your elbow extension and flexion movements in like a super fatigued state. I would avoid that, but the split that I used to reach 18-inch arms and get a good amount of my growth was a modified push-pull legs, and it sounds, you're like, all right, you just told me not to do push-pull legs, now you are. No, it's a very simple solution. You just swap biceps and triceps, and that worked really well. So I did push-pull legs, push-pull, biceps on my push days, triceps on the pull days, and one sneaky little benefit that could be existing in this split is that you are technically training some degree of elbow flexion and extension 4 times a week, each 4 times a week, because if you're pressing on your push days, you're still training your triceps a bit, and then the next day you fully train the triceps, and then same thing on the final 2 days of the split, so 4 days a week. There could be some sneaky little benefit to that, and that could be the reason why I was able to hit 18 inches. I wouldn't say it's the main reason, but it could have an importance that I am unaware of how much that importance is, or how important it is. I can't talk. But I would say your split ultimately doesn't really matter as long as you're not doing like push-pull legs and training a bunch of like push movements and then doing triceps. Other than that, you should be fine. Doing whatever you want, that is. Recently been doing 200 sets per week. 66 of that being for delts. Is that overkill / counterproductive? 66 sets a week for delts. I'm just trying to wrap my head around that. So that would be 20 sets a session 3 times a week. Yeah, that's way too much. Yeah, you're just not training hard enough. You want to get to the point where you can do more if you needed to, but you're like, all right, I'm kind of fried and this doesn't feel like it's doing much. That's kind of the point you want to get to. I would pay a little bit more attention to looking for progression week by week in your training with standardized technique, and I would do, like, I would just start off overhead pressing twice a week for 2, maybe 3 sets, and then picking a side delt variation to do on the first day, and then a rear delt isolation to do on the second day. 2 to 3 sets for everything. You should be growing just fine. Yeah, 200 sets a week for everything, 66 being for delts. Yeah, that's a lot. What do you think about rice bucket forearm workouts? Any food-related videos in the future? I don't really have any particular thoughts on it. I mean, obviously, it's going to train finger extension and flexion pretty well. It's hard to standardize, so it's hard to progress on or detect progress. Aside, you could time it, I guess, but that's hard to standardize your technique and your reps. No food-related videos. My diet is so boring, and I really don't think deeply about it, aside from just being generally healthy and whatnot. There's just going to be better resources out there for you. Favorite music genres? So I grew up listening to hip-hop. I'm Gen Z, so that is kind of just like what we grew up listening to. Obviously, millennials like really grew up with like the real hip-hop. I kind of caught the tail end of that as like an older Gen Z guy. So yeah, hip-hop's kind of like, that's like what I grew up with, and generally kind of what I always go back to, although it's fallen off a lot. I am glad kind of having my teenage years in the 2010s though. Like, I think there was a pretty good amount of hip-hop music. Like, obviously you had Kendrick. I really like Big Crit. Those guys are good. There's a bunch more too. Obviously you got J. Cole. Country's starting to grow on me. I don't listen to it much, but it's fun in the summer. I do find myself enjoying stuff like blues and southern rock quite a bit, even though there's a much more like niche genres. And I don't know a whole ton of artists in those genres, but I find that's kind of what I like most. And I think if those genres were to take off, that would be my favorite. I do kind of like metal. Trying to think of anything else. I can't say there's a whole ton else. I hate pop music. Like, I genuinely hate pop music. Do you track your calories? If so, which is the easiest way you've found? Thank you. I don't track calories, but I have before. I find the easiest way to do it is just to eat the same thing every day. Just, yeah, it helps so much. How much muscle gain when switching to bodybuilding from strength training? Well, strength training is going to be a spectrum, because are you doing like powerlifting and Olympic lifting, or are you training for general strength, which is going to be very close to bodybuilding, probably just with worse technique. So I would say if you switch to bodybuilding training entirely, you will see a little bit better gains in most areas. You'll see a lot better gains in your lagging areas, and you'll notice that your stubborn muscle groups will finally start to grow. So you'll notice you'll have a way more well-rounded physique. Everything else will kind of catch up quite a bit too. Even your stronger areas will see more growth just from making your training designed around growing a muscle as much as you can. So yeah, that's probably what you'll see. Recovery days important or overrated? Entirely dependent on the program and the individual. not an exciting answer, but I would say on a proper program, yeah, they're probably a little bit overrated physically. Like, it's just lifting. It's just lifting. You can train every day if you want to. I would say the mental benefits of rest days outweigh it, though. They do. Like, you're not going to get, I wouldn't necessarily say you're going to get better gains training every day, but you could probably sustain equal rates of growth as training 4 or 5 days a week if you were to train every single day. I just don't think it's necessary, and I think the mental benefits to days off, even if you don't want to take the day off, can help you quite a bit and make you positively anticipate your future training sessions, and I think that can be underrated. All right, a two-parter here. Do you think there's anything inherently wrong with having squat, bench, deadlift in a bodybuilding program? Or is it just that people put too much emphasis on squat, bench, deadlift and end up skipping accessories? That's exactly it. So barbell squats and deadlifts don't need to necessarily be in a program, and obviously neither does bench. But my kind of case with this is, if you're already doing a hip hinge and you're already training your spinal erectors and glutes very well, I just don't see a need for a barbell squat. So unless you're limited on equipment, you have to do a barbell squat. I would rather somebody do like a leg press or a hack squat, pendulum squat, squat press, anything like that, just because it targets the quads better. And like the benefit, in my opinion, the benefit to a barbell squat is you don't have to really do any hip hinges then, because you're already getting your glutes and your spinal erectors. Now you just have to train your hamstrings, and it would be best to train them in isolation. So for me, it's like, why do you need to have barbell squat and deadlift in the program? It doesn't make that much sense. Bench, as far as barbell bench, it's a fine lift. It's not anything special. It's like an A tier roughly lift. I would say Smith bench or a selectorized machine press is the way to go. A prime plate loaded press, that thing's obviously, I think that's the best it gets. I don't think you need them. I think the problem is people get way too carried away with the numbers, and their technique sucks, and then their attachment to those numbers causes a distraction, and it creates this hierarchy in their program where they put all their eggs into the baskets of those, and they start to skip their other lifts. They call them accessory lifts, and if you put all your energy into preacher curls, what carryover does that have to anything with your squat, bench, deadlift when you're focused on getting those numbers up? Like, I've talked so in depth about this earlier on in the channel, so if you haven't seen my old videos, I would go back and watch my videos titled, like, The Problem with the Big Three, or anything about powerlifting or power building. And obviously they're old videos, so I wasn't able to, like, articulate my thoughts exactly the way I wanted to, but I pretty much got my points across, even if it wasn't all perfectly said, or maybe if there was like a slight lack of nuance, you can still see the general points that I was getting across. So I'd go back to those old videos if you're interested. recomp at peak bulk versus mini cut and then restart with bulk. Sabino here. Oh, what's up, Sabino? Yeah, he's one of my clients. So this mostly comes down to preference. If you're somebody that prefers to be on the leaner side in your day-to-day life, I would probably just advocate for a slower bulk and then mini cut at the end of the bulk, so you can, like if you're to like average your body weight and body fat percentage over the course of a year, you will on average be at a lower body fat percentage at any point in time than if you were to recomp, because at the recomp you're taking it slow, but you're still making progress. So I would say if you're talking about optimal gains, go with the recomp at the end of bulk and hang out at that higher body fat percentage where you have the fat stores to be able to make good progress in the gym without needing to be in a surplus. And if you're somebody that really genuinely does prefer to be lean, then yeah, probably going for the mini cut is the way to go. If you do a proper mini cut, it probably won't really interfere with your long-term gains that much, as long as you're not doing it super frequently, but like 5 to 7 weeks of cutting in a calendar year, that should be totally fine. Wide versus close grip for curls, specifically for preachers. I'd say both. I don't think it's going to make a huge difference in your overall bicep growth, but I have noticed that it feels a little bit different, and I've noticed that the strength between the two does kind of carry over to one another. I noticed that I got stronger on my regular grip preacher curls as soon as I started implementing the regular like shoulder width, slightly outside shoulder width grip with the Easy Bar. So I would just do both. Overall, they're both going to grow your biceps really, really well. When is the road to 19-inch arms starting? I mean, once I have 18 inches at a reasonable body fat percentage, I don't want to have to get to like super peak bulk again, just like I did to have to get to 18 inches. So once I have 18 inches under 200 pounds, I would consider going on potentially a road to 19. But that's tough because like that's not going to be like just bulk until I get 19-inch arms. Like that's going to be a very long-term thing, I would imagine. Oh, okay. This is the other guy that had multi-parts earlier, and they're just all out of order. There's, 5 parts not going to work in here. How often do you rotate your splits? Do you listen to music during your lifts, and if so, what genre? Rotating my splits, I probably rotate my split 3 times a year. 2 or 3 times a year I'll rotate it just out of wanting psychological change or like a schedule change or how motivated I am. Like if I'm not that motivated, I'm not going to train 5 or 6 days a week. I'm going to train less, and it'll just work better than not consistently sticking to like a higher frequency program. And my lifts more or less kind of stay the same regardless of the split. So most people that change their splits a ton change everything. I more or less keep most things the same, and I just change the split up a little bit. Do you listen to music? And yeah, so for music, yeah, I mean, usually I do. It's sometimes I just listen to podcasts. I get sick of my music a lot. So sometimes I'll put on like old music that I listened to back in the day to like change things up, and I just keep cycling through the same stuff. I don't really like a lot of new music. Maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. Kind of same genre as I said earlier. What's your favorite fitness YouTuber other than yourself? I mean, again, that's going to be very... That last part just is completely throwing me off. I would say... I'm going to look through my subscriptions real quick. Fitness YouTuber. I really like Dave McConey, Brains and Gains. He has a great channel. The rest of the Noble Natties, of course. Alex Leonidas, I've been following him forever. I love his channel. I like... Who else do we got? Adam Powell has a good channel, competitive natural bodybuilder. Mostly just lifting vlogs and stuff, but it's like like he's a bodybuilder, not an influencer, so it really is pretty cool. Those are more or less the channels I watch most. That's probably that's probably what I would leave it at. For like my top, there's a lot that I really do like, but I can't just say every single one, so I'm just kind of picking. Those are a few of my favorites for sure. Ironically, it's one of those weird things where I don't even watch like that much fitness content just because like I make my own, so it's like there's just not a need to continue to keep watching other people's stuff. Although usually I do tune into like other Noble Natty videos and that kind of stuff. Thoughts on more lift variety versus hammering away at a few lifts multiple times per training week. So I would just start off with less variety, and that will give you more spots to put the variety where it's needed if you do have a stubborn muscle group. So that's what I would do. Master a foundational program, add variety as you need to. Would love to see a list of good stable exercises per muscle if you have limited home gym equipment. So this is where learning the concept of stability will do you more good than just seeing a list, because then you have the ability to choose things yourself. Stability is generally going to be related to how many joints are exposed and how many joints are stable. So if you take something like a standing military press, that's probably going to be the least stable overhead press variation that isn't like split stance or like on one leg or like on a Bosu ball or something. So the reason for that is because your knees, your hips, your shoulders, your spine, none of that's stabilized. You're stable by standing on the floor, but there's no other implements that are supporting any other joints or parts of your body. So the closer you can have stability to the working joints, generally, the better it is for hypertrophy. So that's what I would say there. But if you're just talking about like home gym stuff, I mean, it totally depends on what equipment you have. Yeah, that I can't go too in depth on that because I can't just read off an entire, or like list off an entire list in my head. Any thoughts on Chris Beardsley / Paul Carter training info? Not personality law. It's funny that you have to say that because anytime someone talks about Paul Carter, it's just assumed that it's about his personality. I think their training info is, I like what they do. I do like what they do. I don't want to let the personality override the information, because if you love a certain person, you can't just take anything they say as truth, and if you don't like a certain person, you can't just take everything they say as not true. So you do have to be nuanced when looking at things objectively. I would say the problem I have with Paul Carter is he can be very quick to change his mind on some things and then act like it's impossible that he's wrong. And I don't follow the guy too closely, so take what I say with a grain of salt, but he speaks in absolutes quite a bit, and that's kind of my main problem, where when he says something, he like doesn't elaborate on it too much a lot of the time, and he puts a period after, and it's like end of discussion, end of talk, don't question this, like it's impossible that this is wrong. And that's kind of how it comes across. And he does, to his credit, he does have a lot of content where he really does go in depth and actually explain a lot of it, but a lot of the time he just lacks the nuance that's needed to be able to say things in that conclusive of a way, if that makes sense. How is your experience with higher frequency, same muscle 3 times a week training? Yeah, I have had good progress training 3 times a week. The problem is I do like to train very intensely, and I find that now that I'm strong, I have a harder time getting away with it. So I have to be much more thoughtful with my technique, which is a little bit more of an advanced thing, just because you're not going to be able to have super perfect technique and a super high force output as a beginner. So I think the way you approach 3 times a week training as your training age increases is going to change quite a bit, but as long as you do it properly, it can be done successfully, in my opinion. Solution for forearm pain during easy preacher curls. Take a 2 to 4 week rotation to a non-fixed implement. That can be a bilateral dumbbell or cable curl, supinated or neutral or supinating, alternating, whatever you want to do. You should be fine. Change up the resistance profile, get some good variety, and let the forearm, I assume it's forearm splints, recover for that amount of time, and you should be fine. Check out my video. I can't remember which episode it was of Road to 18-inch arms, but I think it was titled Road to 18-inch arms episode whatever, when to deload, devolume, and take time off, or something along the lines of that. But you'll see it. If you search up like basement bodybuilding, deload, devolume, it will pop up for you. It's like a 7 or 8 minute video, if I remember correctly, on how all that stuff works and how I go about it, because I deal with the same thing on preacher curls. Any tips for a thicker upper back? Power shrugs, chest supported lengthened biased rows where you can get really good protraction and or retraction. That's going to be the way to go, man. Absolutely. How many working sets should someone do per body part? It's lift dependent, it's training age dependent, and it's lifter dependent, it's technique dependent, it's intensity dependent. You can't answer it unless you have context. Generally speaking, 4 to 12 sets per week, I would say, per muscle. You can still go higher than 12 too. It's just it's like I'm trying to say, it's just impossible to give you an actual range for that. So I wouldn't try and reverse engineer your volume like that. What are your maintenance kcals? No idea. Absolutely no idea. 3,000 give or take? I don't know. Do you have specific gear to train neck? And if yes, what do you recommend? No, I don't train my neck. I train my upper traps via power shrugs, if you count that as neck training, but I don't train neck flexion at all. Did you ever strain your biceps? Had any burning, painful sensations? Nope. Training advice for grapplers. I don't have any specific advice for grapplers. I don't have experience with it myself, so I can't give like tailored advice of what muscle groups are going to be most fatigued or have a hard time recovering with grappling training. But I would say try and set your bodybuilding training schedule in a way that you aren't systemically fatigued when doing your hypertrophy training, and you should be fine. Is there any value in using RIR for isolations, or do you just go to failure on them? I wouldn't say there's any value. There's really no direct value in it, but there's probably cases where you can get away with leaving a rep or two in the tank and still make good gains. I don't think it's really good or bad either way. That's kind of my thoughts there. Doing heavy... Oh, it's a two-parter again. These are throwing me off. Thoughts on high-frequency training doing heavy sets? I would probably vary the load up a little bit throughout the week if you're doing high-frequency training. How do you know when it's time to stop gaining? So I assume he means gaining body weight, so like during a bulk. I would just say when you get to a point where you're starting to feel a little bit fat, or you're pushing up towards your general peak waistline or body fat percentage, or visually you're at peak bulk, get to a point where you feel like you're heavy enough to train successfully while recomping. And if you can successfully train at maintenance and still make detectable progress, that's probably a fine time to stop gaining. How much sleep do you get? And what do you think is the lowest amount without affecting gains? Very much so individual dependent and age dependent, training age dependent. I can answer how much sleep I get though. It's usually 7 hours. Sometimes 8. And I usually feel roughly fine on that. Any less, I kind of struggle. Although I do notice as I get older, I can tolerate less sleep much better. Like I used to not even be able to hold a conversation if I slept less than like 6 hours. Now I can. There's like random nights where I'll get 4 or 5 hours of sleep and I'm more or less fine. Like I went to South Carolina earlier this year and I had a flight at 3:45 a.m. and the stress of knowing I had to get up early prevented me from sleeping. I didn't sleep at all that night, and I actually lifted at like 3 p.m. the next day. It was miserable, but I did it. And then I took a nap for 45 minutes, then went out till like 2 a.m. drinking with friends. Like, it was just a nightmare, but I tolerated that much better than I could have when I was like high school, college age or something. 5 days a week training, but only 30 minutes, or 3 days a week, an hour-long session. I would opt for the 3 days a week, hour-long, roughly full body session. That's what I would do. 30 minutes is tough to get in a good amount of work in that amount of time and still hit your frequency for every muscle. Thoughts on getting into coaching / PT as a current serious lifter? Yeah, it's great. It's tough locally, depending on where you live, because you don't have much reach, you have a lot of competition, and you don't have a lot of potential clients. Like, that was the issue I ran into training people in real life. Like, you could get to a point where you're, like, doing pretty good, and you have a lot of clients, but then, like, when you're training, more or less, it's going to be general population. They aren't as serious about it, so they're like, oh, I'll work out for 6 months, and then, like, go do something else or something. So you're not really going to get a specific, like, let's take like my channel now compared to like being a personal trainer in real life. Where I live is a little bit more rural, so my potential options for clients it's not going to be that high. But with this channel, I can reach anybody in any country as long as they have internet access, and I can kind of like I can reach a much more niche population. Like, if you're going to see on average, like, probably 1, maybe 2 serious natural lifters at any commercial gym, how is someone like me ever going to build up a clientele in real life? But if I have a channel, now all those other people that are also struggling to find trainers that could help them, or like-minded lifters, like, that's why the online or YouTube fitness thing is so big. It's because it's so hard to find other like-minded people locally. So, to get back to your initial question, aside from like my thoughts on like in-person versus online, it's a very fulfilling job, very fulfilling career. I really enjoy training people, especially when they enjoy the process too. It just makes it very fulfilling and rewarding. So I would go for it. It's one of those things that you can start off doing part-time too, because it's not like all or nothing. It's not like you either aren't working, you work 40 hours a week as a trainer. Like, you can take on a few clients at once and just kind of learn the ropes and get a feel for it. And then if it's working full time, you're getting more clients. There's going to be times you're working a lot because you kind of are balancing 2 jobs. And then if you want to get into like full-time training, it works pretty well. And if you're good at it and you enjoy it, yeah, I don't see a reason why not to. Inspiration to start lifting. I just thought being jacked was so cool. Like, I remember being a kid and like you would just see like a jacked guy on TV or something like that, and you're like, that looks super cool. Like, I genuinely remember being a little kid and you just like, big jacked guys are like instantly like, it's jaw dropping. You're like, oh, I want to be like that. So I remember being a little kid and like I went to Olympia Sports with my brother, and I just immediately went to the dumbbell rack and just picked up the heaviest dumbbells that I could curl, and they were 8 pounds, and I basically begged him to buy them for me, and he eventually did. I think it was either 6 or 7 at the time, and I still have them, funny enough. So I just always thought it was cool. It was never like, I don't have that crazy story of like, oh, I was the skinniest kid that was bullied and I hated myself. Like, that's not me. I just thought it was really cool. Not much deeper than that. Strength / arm size for preacher curls. My arms are 17.5 right now, and I'm preacher curling 105 with very, very strict form, full ROM, like pad wedged all the way into my armpits, 4.7. So that's about what I'm at. How much validity is there to using wrist size to determine arm size potential? I already answered that one earlier. Can you do a dedicated JM press video? I never seem to get it right. Yeah, I would definitely consider that, because most people don't do it correctly because it's a very niche lift and there's a bunch of different ways to do it. So you can't fault people on that. Plans on making more content similar to the strength curve vid, one of your best? Yes, I probably will do more stuff like that. Key difference between a novice and intermediate. Already talked about that one too. Thoughts on rings? They're expensive. Miss Basement's super lucky. Like Olympic rings? I like them. They're not ideal for gains, but they can certainly get you jacked, and a lot of people really enjoy them. Not my cup of tea, but yeah, absolutely. You can get a lot of good work in on rings. How did you mitigate elbow or any applicable joint pain on the road to 18-inch arms? I kept my volume reasonable. That's probably most of it. 2 times a week, full body. 2 times a week, full body. 1 intense day, 1 volume day with GPP on rest days. Thoughts? Are you Alex Leonidas? Yeah, the intensity day and the volume day isn't necessary in my opinion. You can kind of just keep each day more or less the same as far as volume and intensity goes. I wouldn't sacrifice one for the other. Although I'd make sure you have a good baseline of intensity and then adjust volume as needed is probably a better way to say that. GPP is great stuff, and that's probably what I'd leave it at. Just get some good variety throughout the week in terms of your exercise selection instead of it varying your volume and intensity. How do I get jacked and juicy like you? Subscribe, brother. How to properly work on a lagging muscle, higher volume frequency, etc. So I covered this in my How to Break Through a Plateau video, which I would definitely check that out. It will answer anything. It will answer it better than I can answer in here. How to know when to add or remove sets, generally going to be based on recovery. Add sets if you are recovering fine. Your volume is generally lower on the normal spectrum of what you see most other people doing. And if you are running into injuries and nagging pains and that kind of stuff, then I'd decrease your volume, especially if it's in like the moderate to high ranges of what you see most other people doing. Thoughts on alcohol for physical and mental health? It can definitely help your mental and physical health. No, I think a little bit of alcohol is good for your mental health because it is almost like an incentive to socialize. As long as it's within reason, people absolutely demonize alcohol, especially in the fitness industry, but if you're an unhealthy person and you're sedentary at your job and you're depressed and you're just not doing that great in life compared to what you want to be doing, and you're not happy with that, you're not fulfilled in life, alcohol is probably not the best option for you right then and there. But if you're an otherwise like generally like healthy person that does cardio and you play a sport and you lift and you eat super healthy, then going out and rewarding yourself by having a few drinks is probably better for your mental health. Like the way I see it is if you isolate yourself by not drinking, and don't get me wrong, I understand what I'm saying here. I'm not saying you have to drink to socialize, but I'm saying realistically in the real world where the most enjoyable social places to be involve drinking, the benefits that you get of the extra socialization and opportunities to meet new people outweigh the potential tiny little side effects of a little bit of drinking. So just be reasonable about it and be honest with yourself about it. Are you using that as an excuse to get hammered 3 times a week, or are you using it as a good way to balance out your otherwise super healthy lifestyle and to get more socialization in? Like, that's just the way I see it personally. And people are going to hate me for it, but it is what it is. That's just my honest thoughts. Should you train to 0 reps in reserve on all sets? Depends. It really does depend on the lift. So more or less, yeah, there's going to be some lifts that you don't want to go all the way to 0 RIR for, but otherwise, most stuff, especially in a properly made hypertrophy program, are one along the lines of what I would make, aside from like RDLs and stiff leg deadlifts. Yeah, most stuff to 0 RIR is totally fine. All right, it got way too cold in the basement, practically getting hypothermia. My hands are entirely numb, so let them warm up a little so I can actually scroll. Okay, so that was it for the Instagram comments. And now I'm on to the YouTube community post. So first question from Atlas Power Shrugged. What 1RM preacher curl do I have to get for 18-inch biceps? I would say if you haven't heard of the 3, 4, 5, 6 plate strength standards, that's obviously 3 plate bench, 4 plate squat, 5 plate deadlift, 6 plate preacher curl. Get familiar. Next question, hey BB, congrats on the 30K. What's your back training philosophy? Should one have both a wide grip vertical pull and row and narrow grip vertical pull and row? It's not a bad idea to include everything. I would just look at it a little bit deeper than movement patterns. I would look at what muscle you're targeting specifically, because the technique that you use, regardless of your grip, it's more about your intent will determine what muscle you're training. So if you're trying to target the traps, You don't necessarily need a variety with your grips, with your rowing. You can just emphasize scapular retraction and or protraction. Same goes for the lats. Like, it's a good idea to have a variety of planes that you're training your lats in. So you might want to have something, whether it's a vertical pull or a row or a diagonal pull where your elbow's a little more tucked, and then one where your elbow's a little bit more flared out to the side. That way you can kind of train both functions of the lats. Whether it's through a row or a vertical pull, I think that's a little bit besides the point. I would just look at the muscles, mainly the traps and the lats specifically. And I don't know if I said thank you already for the congrats, but thank you. I can't remember if I said it or not. How do you separate muscle swelling from actually hypertrophy for your measurements, especially if you're training with some reasonable frequency? So, if you are always in a little bit of a swelled state, constantly kind of training every muscle twice a week, I don't think that it really matters because the swell is always going to be there. Of course, it will fluctuate your measurements if you're measuring every single day. So if you measure the day after training your arms, then that might be a little bit inflated. But if you trained your arms 6 days ago, that might be a little bit more deflated. So what I would say is there's really no specific way to figure it out aside from just kind of guesstimating. I hate that word. I don't know why I said it, but it's kind of just what you have to do. So if you say that like a post-workout swell lasts for, say, 3 to 5 days, and muscle atrophy starts in, say, 1 to 2 weeks, then what I would do is measure every day for a week and a half, and then assess your gains. So if you take, say, a week or so off once or twice a year, after 5 days of not training a specific muscle group, then you're probably good to take your measurements then and find that sweet spot of post-swell but pre-atrophy. It's probably a window of a handful of days. But either way, if you're always kind of in a somewhat swelled state, I think you can just almost count that as hypertrophy, because assuming you're going to be training anyways, like it is kind of part of who you are. If you were to stop training entirely and assess your gains, then you're going to lose your gains anyways. If you're an advanced lifter who has tried a lot of ways to get jacked, considering powerlifting as your starting point. Oh, I read that wrong. Let me restart. You're an advanced lifter who has tried a lot of ways to get jacked, considering powerlifting as your starting point. I don't know if you've ever tried super high volume, but if you did, what are your experiences with extremely high intensity, close to powerlifting? Only difference is not focusing on the specific lifts. Medium classic bodybuilding volume and intensity, and very high volume. Basically sets and reps or close to that. What did you learn from each? What did you keep from each? What did you reject from a bodybuilding perspective? So, powerlifting wasn't my starting point. That was the kind of second method of training I got into. And I would even say it was power building and then powerlifting and then break from training and then pure bodybuilding since then. So with pure bodybuilding at the start, just not executed properly with my first 2-ish or so years of training. Okay. I don't know if you ever tried super high volume, but if you did, what are your experiences with extremely high intensity? So I did used to do a lot of volume and train very hard. It was for probably 6-7 months or so in 2018 when I transitioned to more along the lines of power building. So it was when I had built my base of muscle with 2 years of like pure bodybuilding, never touched squat, bench, or deadlift. And I had built a substantial amount of muscle for a beginner, early intermediate, and I noticed that I was getting beat up bad when I trained high volume and high intensity. I was just like a push-pull legs bro. I was like 19 or 20 or something, and I would just get fried. Like I was dealing with constant lower back pain. I was squatting and deadlifting twice a week. So 4 days a week, like on separate days, like deadlift on pull day, squats on leg day, etc. I kind of swapped back and forth between the two, but it was a lot of work and a lot of intensity, and I I made some pretty good gains and everything, but once I started to get like really strong on squat and deadlift, it was not sustainable, and I kind of just switched into powerlifting, still with a higher volume approach, but it was just higher volume in terms of squat, bench, deadlift, kind of lower, half-hearted training on everything else, and that did not work well at all. That's kind of what my entire channel is revolved around. But I would say training with super high volume teaches you that you aren't fragile. Yes, you get nagging pains and aches and all that kind of stuff, but you aren't just going to like snap in half from training high volume and high intensity. Shows you what you're capable of, and it is, I would rather somebody come from like a high volume, high intensity, overdoing everything, they go too far in terms of effort, and then reel it in with proper programming, than somebody to like, all right, start super small and like, never learn how to train hard and just focus on like technique and that kind of stuff. Like I didn't word that the way I wanted to. It is what it is. But like, yeah, I'd rather you go way overboard and then reel it in with good programming. Earn your programming. That's a video I've made in the past. Than for someone to like, I guess I'd rather have that than someone to like hyper fixate on perfect programming when they don't even know how to train hard, is more or less what I'm saying. And that's pretty much all my thoughts there. Next question, what is your take on protein? I know you don't eat tons of meat. Do you supplement with protein powder? Yes, I do supplement with protein powder. Is there a certain target you aim for? Roughly three quarters or a gram per pound for 3/4 of my body weight. So if I'm 190, I'll kind of estimate that based on my lean weight, say it's 165 or roughly, then I'll aim for 120, 130, maybe 150 to play it safe, but I really just try and like get 30, 40 grams in each meal, have a couple snacks, and I'll pretty much be good to go. I've noticed I haven't needed a whole ton of protein to make good progress, even in more advanced training ages. And I'm also not super lean, so I think unless you're a competitive bodybuilder and you're always kind of within striking distance of contest lean for at least most of the year, then protein diet overall is going to be much more important. But for someone like me that hangs out in your peak bulk, I just think diet's a little bit less important, even though I am nearly, 9-10 years into lifting at this point. Then she says, my protein intake is consistently low, maybe 50 to 60 grams a day, vegetarian diet, but I've been able to make progress despite that. Yeah, maybe these gains are just newbie gains because I've only been lifting seriously for about 2 years, and congrats on 30K, that's a big achievement. Your channel's been super helpful to me, thank you. Yeah, thank you. No, I really appreciate that. So I would aim for more than 50 to 60 grams a day if you want to be ideal. Of course, I don't know your overall body weight, so if you are 100 pounds, you could maybe kind of get away with that, but if you are building a substantial amount of muscle, you'll quickly kind of grow out of that 100-pound or so frame, or not frame, but amount of overall body weight. So I would probably try increasing it at least for a little bit. So if you're making okay progress at 50 to 60 grams, see how 70 or 80 grams goes, and if you're making better progress and you feel better, maybe stick with that. And if it's like unsustainable and your meals are just like not that good because it might be harder to get an adequate protein with a vegetarian diet, and your progress isn't better, then I would probably cut back to 50 or 60 and just kind of stick with that for a bit until you realize that you need to increase your protein intake at least. Do you have any tips for measuring muscle size for non-limb muscles, aka chest, shoulders, glutes? Whenever I go to measure my chest or waist, I find it hard to standardize where I put the tape, usually relying on cues like thinnest part of the midsection or just above nipples, below the shoulder blades, etc. So with this, yeah, non-limb muscles, or at least areas that don't have a specific peak or valley, don't put as much stock into those for super short-term measurements. So if you're looking to detect progress in like your pecs, don't take your torso circumference 2 weeks apart and see if that can detect gains, because the measurement error, the margin for measurement error will override your margin for projected growth in that area, even if things are going really well. So with all that said, once your added gains total more than what the margin for measurement error is, it usually is going to be at least 6 months, depending on how how deep you are into your training age, then you can look at long-term trends and see how measurements like that are going. If we're talking specifically about like cues and tips to measure properly, what I would say is standardize the most you can with your breath and your posing. Just if you have like a variance in how inhaled or exhaled you are, or if you're flexing your lats or flexing your pecs, what I would do is for the torso measurement, just full exhale, relaxed torso measurement as high as you can get in your armpits, fully relaxed state, and that can standardize it pretty well. For the waist, what I would do, either relaxed state at the narrowest point of the waist. If you have a hard time finding a narrowest point, or it varies based on how much body weight you're gaining, I would just go right around the belly button, just keep it consistent that way. Another one you can do is just flex, or full exhale, flex the abs as much as you can without sucking in or pushing out. Just flex them, tighten them up, measure from there, and you should be good. For something like the quads, where some people can measure their quads consistently because they have an actual peak. Most people's quads are more of a cone shape, especially myself, where my teardrop in the lower quad area is basically non-existent, just genetically. What I do is I just measure 8 inches from the top of my kneecap when I'm flexing, take the circumference from there. There's still going to be error. It's not going to be perfect, but over time you'll be able to see the trends properly. And that's basically the best you can get. So not all measurements are created equal. That's where it just gets a little bit tricky. And for muscles of the torso, sometimes relying on your training instead of measurements is the way to go. And for muscles like the arms, relying on measurements, or even the legs, calves especially, those can help quite a bit. Why have you stopped doing supersets in your training? So I was never big on supersets. I've experimented with them a little bit. The times when I was doing most supersets was when I was training before work. I would work fairly early at like 9:30. I'm not a morning person either, so I'd have to be in the gym by like 7 a.m., which for me is just not enjoyable when I got out of work fairly late too. So I stopped because I don't have to do supersets anymore because I lift and coach for my job. So I can pick what time of day that I want to train, and if I don't have to do a superset, I'm not doing a superset. I don't enjoy them. I like to be fully focused and fully fresh for every single set I do, and I'd much rather have that than feel a little bit winded, a little bit gassed, not fully mentally prepared to go into a set. So I'm not huge on supersets unless you have to do them or really value your time. How best to use drop sets for arm training? Congratulations on the 30K. Drop sets I'm not huge on. I never do drop sets. But what I would say is, if you want to use a drop set, use it on a less stable lift, so maybe something like a tricep push down. That can be a fine way to just like use a little bit less weight, but you probably won't ever need drop sets to reach your potential. Thoughts on if a person can do lean bulk and recomp cycles forever if they don't like cutting, say between 14% to 18% body fat? Probably not, because you're not going to be able to be in a calorie surplus for an extended period of time, and that might be required as you advance. I don't know if you'll be able to hit your potential with most of your time in recomping, because recomp progress as you advance is going to be very slow because the overall poundages of muscle you're adding to your frame are just low to the point where it's not going to be able to take enough body fat off quick enough to warrant an extended amount of time in a surplus. So yeah, recomps are very underrated in my opinion, but you are going to have to cut at some point if you want to reach your potential. I don't know if anybody's reached their like quote unquote natural limit without doing any type of cut. How do you implement cardio in your 4-day upper lower home gym program? Focus more on HIIT or LISS? Oh, you can do whatever you want. LISS is obviously going to be easier to recover from, especially if there's overlap with your cardio training on a specific day. I would just do whatever you want. And HIIT depends on the movements and the type of cardio that you're doing. So that can be a little bit more fatiguing. I would generally favor LISS, but if you're on an off day and you're training a muscle that's already recovered, you're not training it the next day. When I say training a muscle, I mean having some type of crossover recovery impact, like sprints or something before or after a leg day. Like I would avoid something like that, but you can just keep general recovery in mind, and you can do what you want as long as you're reasonable. Hey BB, I've watched your channel. This is I'm not gonna be able to answer this. Is super long split. Yeah, I'm not going to be able to answer that. Hi, Basement, you are the GOAT. I've been lifting seriously for 5 years and experimented with most variables, but I cannot feel my chest. I can do dips and DB presses and will have a sore chest, but any isolation lift I feel really weird. On flies I feel my biceps, and on many press machines I feel front delta triceps. I know mind muscle connection isn't that important anyway, but it's just a lot more fun, and I just can't get a chest bump. So mind muscle connection it's not required. It also doesn't have a standardized meaning, which makes it a little bit tricky. So what I would do is try and feel your chest working, but you don't have to feel like the perfect stretch or the perfect squeeze. Generally, the biggest mistakes with chest pressing is people gripping a little bit too narrow, especially with something like a dumbbell press, where if you are letting your forearms not be parallel, so if they're caving in just a little bit, that puts so much tension on the triceps and takes a lot off of the pecs. So I'd focus, number one, just make sure your grip's good. If anything, opt for a slightly wider grip. The main thing I would focus on is scapular and shoulder depression. So your pecs, like I said earlier in the Q&A, I know the vast majority of people aren't going to be just watching start to finish, so I will explain it again. With your pecs, they're going to leverage the rib cage. So when you're training your pecs, if you let your shoulders rise and your scaps come up like this and everything's kind of elevated, your pec is now kind of above your rib cage. Your pec is nice and high, your rib cage is still down here. So you're not going to be able to generate much tension or create a nice stable base for your pec to wrap around, similar to your lats, where if you do like, say, like a neutral grip pull up or pull down, or like a diagonal, or even a row with a super tucked elbow narrow grip, and you're kind of pulling from like your center or even across on the other side or something, you'll be able to feel your lat stretch around your rib cage. Your pec works the same way. So if your shoulders are up here and you're pressing like this, your pecs aren't going to be able to wrap around your rib cage. So focus on jamming your scap and your shoulder down just like you were training your lats. Let your pecs stretch around your rib cage, and you'll feel them a lot more. Do that with a slightly wider grip than what you maybe normally use, unless you're already using a wide grip, and that should help. I would have to see your technique to give you proper cues, but that's what it sounds like. When I hear you feel all delts and triceps, that tells me narrow grip, up high shoulders. I just fix that, focus on the cues I mentioned, and hopefully that fixes your issue. Next question. How important is a consideration of aesthetics in training / working out / bodybuilding? What does it mean to you? So aesthetics, that can be the goal. It can be something you enjoy in the present. So I think I think aesthetics are going to be very important, because nobody wants to have like an ugly physique. I mean, you can look at, say, like, if you're just like a natural lifter that is kind of training for like general strength, you want to get a little bit bigger. Typically what I find when somebody isn't on a well-rounded bodybuilding program and they just kind of do what they want, do the popular lifts, you end up with guys that have super small delts, super small biceps, no calves. Like, it's just not really a good look. No upper traps. Like, you want to avoid that physique, because looking at your own physique, and when you look at your physique before you start lifting, it can be a source of motivation because you have a reason to change it. When you put in all those hours, all that hard work, and your physique looks out of whack and not like you want it to look, then you start to look at it a little bit more resentfully, and I think that can be a potential issue, where if you go into looking at your physique with expectations, you're going to be more prone to criticizing your own physique. So if you take aesthetics into account and make your physique look balanced and look good, then even like earlier on in the process, or just in the process as a whole, you will look better at an earlier training age, and I just think that I just think that part of the illusion of bodybuilding is the appearance of size, and I think proportions play a very big role in that. So I think part of what makes me look big is my proportions, but I think if I was to like have very small arms or very small delts or something, I think I would look not just smaller in that area, I think everything would look much smaller. So I think that's very important. And then I think aesthetics in the process are important too, just in terms of like what you wear to the gym, the music you listen to, the attitude that you embrace, the lifts that you do, like your own kind of aesthetic that you bring to the gym. It is going to be very important. You look at like any pro athlete, they have their own special warm-up routine, they have their own style, they have their own attitude, their own mindset. Like, everybody's unique. The best of the best are all unique, and whether it's the chicken or the egg, why not emulate that? So I think your own kind of aesthetic in the process and your own aesthetic goal in terms of what physique you're striving for. I think those are both very important. I think they're all kind of somewhat subjective, but I think if you the better idea you have of what you're chasing after, the more on track you'll stay towards your goal. So it's almost like a form of accountability. What are your thoughts on strength standards for naturals, and should they be high like Alex Leonidas said? I mean, there's just way too many variables to talk about strength standards, because body weight comes into play, leverages come into play, training age comes into play, technique comes into play. So it's one of those things where it's like it's like close to being a good concept, and then you're like, all right, well, there's this and this and this. Okay, yeah, so maybe like, all right, so yeah, you'll be big if you can bench between 200 and 300 pounds. You'll look like an intermediate, like, obviously, like, yes. So it's like, all right, like, how helpful even is that? I get that they can kind of have a time and a place, and I think it's useful to understand that strength standards are a concept, but it's not something you can take and run with it. It's more of just like a general kind of assessment to see relatively where you're at in the process. But I don't put much stock into them, and I do think they have been overrated before. Not right now, but they have been overrated before for sure. Thoughts on cable preacher curl versus free weight? Do they have the same benefits? For cable, it depends how you set it up. The free weight, the gravity follows you wherever you go. You can't really escape it. So with the cable preacher curl, if you're set up 10 feet behind the cable origin and the cable origin's high, no, it's a completely different lift. If you set up where at peak resistance your hands are right above the cable origin and it's nice and low, yeah, I mean, that's going to be more or less a free weight preacher curl with a tiny little bit more stability, I guess, depending on what attachment you're using. But I would stick to a free weight preacher curl, because you can't make a free weight preacher curl better, but you can make it worse by using something else. That's my rule of thumb for preachers. I really appreciate your methods against progressive overload anxiety. Do you have a solution for volume anxiety? Always feeling like you should do more sets, exercises, etc. I do have a solution. It's that you have to train harder. And that might sound very harsh, but the only time you want to leave the gym knowing that any more work that you are going to do is just not productive and it doesn't feel right and you feel fried. You don't have to go always to that point, but what I would suggest for you is make your process, how do I cause an adaptation to happen that I can then realize the next time I come back to the gym, instead of everything needs to happen right now and today's my last day of lifting. That's what I'd switch your mindset to, and it really should help. I've been there before where I was a beginner and it felt like I was training hard, but I would watch my form clips and I'm like, yeah, I'm really not training that hard. At least not as hard as I could be, I should say. And from there, you're always going to feel like you can do more, because you can do more. Once you start training really hard, you're going to be like, okay, well, I could do more, but I'm already fried and there's like nothing productive left for me to do. Like, I'll try something, but like I'm not really feeling the muscle that I'm supposed to be training. Other muscles are taking over. Like, that's the feeling you want to get to, and then your body will very much internally tell you when you've done enough. If you're observant, you'll kind of realize what that is. And if you're not feeling that, something is probably off with your intensity. And volume isn't always better with volume, literally just like anything else. Do you think direct forearm work is necessary for maximizing growth, or will normal curls bring enough stimulus? If direct forearm work is beneficial, what would be your volume recommendations, considering it's a small muscle group? So the size of the muscle group doesn't have that much to do with the volume. I'd say volume is probably more closely related to whether it's a stubborn muscle group or not, so kind of based on genetics and your technique and the functions and regions of that specific muscle. So for the forearms, what I would say is focus on wrist and finger flexion. I would train it twice a week, start at 2 sets per, and grow from there as needed. What would be your guideline for someone trying not so successfully to learn to lat spread? My V-taper is pretty good when I'm relaxed. When I execute my parody of a spread, my lats seem to get smaller. So you are focused on squeezing your scaps. You're either keeping them in place, or you're probably just retracting your scaps. That will make your lats just go behind you, so it looks like you have no lats. First off, just know that you do have lats in all likelihood, and you're just not flexing them properly, which obviously you can tell here. So what I would focus on is scapular protraction. So lift your elbows out at about 45 degrees. Try one at a time. Like flex your lat, and it will kind of just pop out when your elbow's out to your side like this. Do it on the other side. You can even see through, kind of through my flannel. If I pull this in, it's being held out by actual muscle. You can see that's an actual lat out there. And it's not because my lat is just that big. It's because, well, obviously, yeah, my lats are enormous, but the scap is protracted and pushing it out so much farther than it could, than it basically needs to be. So focus on protraction. Let the scaps come out instead of pinching them behind you. Let them get as far apart as you can, like you're trying to wrap them out and around your rib cage. Keep your elbows flared out. Flex the lats. Try one side at a time, and they'll pop out, and then you can barely fit through door frames. What is a good way to train the traps without excessive axial loading? Power shrugs, wide snatch grip, deadlifts, etc. worked really well for me, but I got a QL sprain, which means that I have to be careful with lower back volume for some time. So for this, it's important to know that your upper traps will, for the most part, still be trained just from focusing on retraction and protraction in your rowing. So if anything, what you could do is find a row that you can comfortably lean back a little bit more on, and to the point where you can feel some resistance going against scapular elevation. So if you just retract, your upper traps are still working. Your upper trap muscles, the muscle fibers, actually run closer to horizontally than vertically, aside from a few kind of on the neck right here. So retraction still trains them really well. What you can do from here is you could even do kind of like a mechanical drop set. I did this literally last week, where if you do cable rows focusing on retraction, go to failure, a few reps past failure, whatever, lean back at like 45 degrees or so. If you can lean back even more, even all the way back, if your bench is long enough for that, go for it. And you can just do cable shrugs like that, because your traps are already pre-fatigued. You can use less weight and just take them to failure that way. It's not the most optimal and most efficient way to train them, but like in the short term, for like now, next few months or whatever, that would work totally fine, I think. Your thoughts on moving exercises from muscle groups you're prioritizing to the beginning of the workout? Biceps and delts are my weak points, so I recently started doing them first so I can be as fresh as possible for them. I moved chest and back to third, fourth, fifth slot on my 2 upper days, running an upper lower rest, upper lower delts, arms, plus pullover split. Thanks, I'm a huge fan of your work, and you are such a precious resource of information. Keep it up, man. I really appreciate the kind words. Thank you a ton. So, for prioritization, I'm not huge on pushing the high priorities earlier on in the session, especially if it's an upper-lower split. The reason for that is because you just don't want to be training your arms before your torso. You want to train your proximal muscles, then your more distal muscles after that, just to prevent any fatigue in a more distal area from interfering with your performance on, or becoming a limiting factor on your more proximal muscles. So I wouldn't override that rule of thumb just to train something in a slightly fresher state. What I would do is just, again, I'd probably reference my plateau video where I kind of talk about like a stubborn muscle group, and you'll be able to learn what I would do from there. Even on my road to 18-inch arms, my arms are the most stubborn muscles for me to grow for the most part on my body. I still did them at the end of my push and pull sessions, of course with biceps and triceps swapped on the push and pull days though, from what you would usually see. What's your opinion on training twice a day? The logic being that if you split up your workouts, it will enable you to get more quality out of the same volume because you're hitting more muscles when they're fresh. I know it's not going to be applicable for everyone's lifestyle, but do you think it could make a difference, and have you considered it for yourself? So you said the logic being that splitting up your workouts will enable you to get more quality out of the same volume. I don't think it would let you get more quality out of the same volume, because if you're splitting up your volume, then if you're training the same movement or a very similar movement pattern, like same region, same function of a muscle, you'll be interfering with the recovery process a little bit. So I wouldn't do like mid pecs in the morning and then like flat pressing mid pecs in the evening. But if you're doing like, say, like a flat press before work, and then on your lunch break you do an incline press, like that technically kind of can work. It's still not like, I wouldn't interfere with the recovery process like that. It's just not a big enough benefit to be worth doing. If you have to do it out of necessity, or like it's a true preference and you really enjoy training that way, then it's fine. But as far as volume quality goes, I don't think the benefits would be enough to make that worth doing. How to get veiny, is it all down to body fat percentage, or is there a way to get the veins themselves bigger? Don't live in New England. At least in the winter. Live in a warmer climate, get bigger, stay at a lower body fat percentage, and other than that, it's mostly genetic. No questions have popped in my head, but thanks for 30K. Thanks, Dynaspinner, you're an OG here on the channel. Appreciate that, man. Congrats. Thank you. When should a lifter shift their training towards specific weak points? My SBD is 120, 140/100 kilos. So many would say to focus on building a bigger base before specializing on, say, arms. Do you agree with this advice? Not at all. Just train, literally just train the muscles you want to train. Like, go for the physique you want. A base does nothing. Like, you can deadlift all you want. It does not assist your arm training. You can get the biggest squat you want. It does not help with your arm training. Like, the more time and energy you spend on training that isn't productive towards your goals, the more resentful you grow towards your training. So chase what you want. Just do it properly, and you'll be totally fine. And there's nothing, the arms aren't an inferior muscle to anything else. It's all very subjective. So I would keep training everything, but I would train exactly the way you want for the exact outcome that you want. There's no such thing as a base. As far as specific weak points, I would wait until you know it's a weak point and to where you can tell if it's lagging or if it's more stubborn. So, mid-intermediate phase, if you're at 120 squat, bench, deadlift, so that's what, a 270-pound squat, if we're talking pounds. Yeah, you're probably not quite at the point where you need to worry about weak points or anything, because you're still in that phase where you're probably going to be growing pretty rapidly. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about weak points yet, but I wouldn't hold back from training it. Like, don't not train your arms, or don't avoid arm training just because people think you should build a base or something. That doesn't make any sense. Hey Landon, what are your volume recommendation ranges for late stage, intermediate to advanced lifters? So that's the stage where your volume is going to have to be toned down a little bit, because you're just so strong you can generate so much fatigue and stimulus from a given set. So it is kind of frequency dependent, but it's generally going to be lower than what you were doing at the early to mid-intermediate stage. I'm not going to be able to give specific recommendations, but generally I'm of the belief that it's going to be a little bit lower than what you did at your peak in terms of volume. Don't be afraid to go lower. Just make sure you are. Don't be the guy that like goes lower in volume and just hopes it works. Like, actually measure your progress week over week, and it's going to be tough to detect measurements and progress pictures that much at that point in training. So for the very short term, rely on your numbers on stable, very standardized lifts with the same technique time over time, and that can give you a good insight within a shorter, like 4 to 8 week time frame generally. Any advice on how to get as broad as possible shoulders while having pretty short clavicles? And what do you think about starting every upper full training with arms and delta isolation? So the latter part of that, no, I would not do arms and delts at the start of an upper or a full body session. Not necessary at all, as I kind of explained in one of the previous questions. For getting as wide as possible, you're gonna want to train your side delts, but rear delts are super, super important too for having the 3D look. They are very underrated. So I would do that. Do the usual, get big lats. I would still try and grow your traps, because just from like my own perspective, you almost look wider if you have a trap and a shoulder and an arm, rather than just kind of skinny, nothing really here, and just like a medium-sized shoulder width. So if you can have that separation between your upper traps and your delts and your arms, that would be key. I would also say grow your extremities as much as possible, particularly the arms if we're talking about shoulder width. So get huge arms, that will make you look a little bit wider, as long as they don't overshadow your shoulders. But having giant shoulders and arms will help a ton. lats and traps, I do think, unpopular opinion, but the traps, I do think they'll make you look a little bit wider because of that separation. It just adds like texture and depth that I do think can be important. What do you recommend for volume and intensity for someone in an extreme cut? If that doesn't make sense, let me be vaguely specific. What are your recommendations for someone who found weightlifting when they were morbidly obese and is coming at body weight from the other side? Like a 300-pound person who's cutting to 200 and stopped getting newbie gains halfway and isn't ready to bulk and maintain yet. So if you found lifting when you were obese, you're not really going to be able to tell if you're a beginner, intermediate, or whatnot because your muscle's still covered up, and the deficit and weight and the rate of weight loss can really override any way of measuring your progress. So that is going to be tough to detect progress. I would just follow the general recommendations I give out on this channel. So I can't give a specific range for what I would say is best for volume, but I would say if you're training every muscle group between 5 and 12 total sets per week, you should be fine. Just don't go too extreme in either direction. Anywhere in that range should be fine, but don't take that like too literally. Like, don't think, oh, 12 is the high end, that's perfect, 5 is the low end, that's going to suck, because it is going to be very individual. It's very lift dependent. Depends on how skilled you are at all these lifts. Like, there's a lot more nuance to it, but I would say try just 3 sets per muscle twice a week. That's what I would recommend. Like, that's what I would start you off at if you were a client of mine. How do you balance playing sports with lifting? I play football, soccer, boxing, and like yourself, love me some hockey. Let's go. Example, if 2 to 3 per week football, do I lift after my practice / games, or do I do less lifting sessions during the week? So it depends on your training program. So what I would do is figure out how many days a week you have available to train without having another sport. And I would always try and do your lifting before the sports that you're doing, just because those sports are more cardio intensive. So if you have, let's say, if you're playing a sport 3 times a week, I would consider lifting 3 or 4 times a week. So you could do like a 3-day full body split where you train your full body sessions on the days that you don't have your sport. You could do an upper lower split where you train a couple days on days that you don't have your sport on, and then maybe 2 of the other an upper and a lower session are like on the same day but before you have your sport. That's what I would do personally. I wouldn't overthink it. I just wouldn't lift right after you do like a cardio intensive sport. Next question. What has been your experience with 1 time per week leg training? Do you still see leg growth during your road to 18-inch arms? I purchased your push-pull legs push-pull on Boost Camp, and I'm keen to give it a shot, but I'm just a bit worried about whether legs will just maintain or if I can still get growth. So, good question. So, most people can still get some growth training legs once a week. So, rather than impacting the other push and pull sessions by sprinkling leg training into those, I figured for that program, it would be best just to give legs their own day. You train 1 more day per week, and you can still, if you're more advanced, maintain your legs. If you're early on in your training, your legs will still grow, just at a bit of a slower rate. So, I could probably still grow my legs if I was training them once a week personally, but I don't know why I said personally so many times. I don't want to dedicate a training day psychologically to legs doing them once a week when I can just more or less maintain them, sprinkling them into my other days so I'm not in the gym as many days per week. So you will just have to, it depends on your training age, is ultimately the answer to this. So I would measure your progress, I would measure your quads, I would measure your glutes, I would measure your calves. Those are 3 very easy muscle groups to measure. And I would look at your progressive overload on standardizable, stable lifts, which that program obviously offers. Can you give a couple examples of how you might tweak your base program on Boost Camp for more arms or chest bias or quad bias? I would have to look into the program itself. I'm not going to be able to do that off the top of my head, but generally what I would do is if I'm biasing a certain muscle group, if I'm doing an upper-lower split, a muscle that's an average priority, not super specifically high or particularly low, I'm going to do one lift for roughly 3 sets. If something's prioritized, I'm going to pick 2 variations for that muscle. So I'm going to train 2 regions and or 2 functions. I'm going to do 2 sets on each of those, or 2 sets on the first and 1 set on the second lift, so the volume's either equal or 1 set more. The volume's kind of besides the point. It's more about the variety. You can't specialize in everything, so if you do want to prioritize a muscle group in addition to what's already prioritized, you're going to have to deprioritize another. So remove a variation and then maybe add a set to the initial variation that you do happen to keep in. Congratulations, appreciate that. When it comes to bicep training specifically, I've had a spider physique from neglecting my arms, starting strength mentality. Yeah, but it started training my arms. I train my biceps 3 times a week, cycling through preachers, elbow supported seated dumbbell curls, and hammer / spider curls. 1 curl variation per session on average 3 sets, 6 to 15 reps each. How important is training close to failure for big biceps? And as I'm finding it difficult to train close to failure on isolation exercises than compounds. So I would first figure out why you're finding it difficult to train close to failure. Yeah, it's going to be very important to train close to failure for bicep growth. Definitely. So I would do what you can to get closer to failure, if that means doing everything in pretty low rep ranges so you have less other fatigue factors kicking in and making it more systemically and psychologically challenging. I would do that. Like for preachers, I'm usually in the 5 to 7 rep range. I don't go much higher than that because you get out of breath, the set drags on, you get more of a pump, more of a burn, and that's more distracting. It's hard to focus that whole time. So going a little bit lower in reps is totally fine. I wouldn't be super low in reps with like a super short bias lift, but other than that, yeah, that's totally fine to go a little bit lower for the most part. 15's a little high. I never train my arms up to 15 reps. It's usually 6 to 10, 5 to 10 even. Next question. I already raised this question on Instagram. Okay, yeah, I got you then. What resources, if any, did you use to become an online coach? Any advice for someone starting? So just immerse yourself in the fitness industry. Like PT certifications and stuff, some of them are okay. A lot of them are a complete waste of time. They just kind of like make you a very well-rounded but jack of all trades, master of none type trainer, where you know like the most random things, but you don't actually know, you don't have like a comprehensive knowledge of like the basic concepts of lifting and muscle growth. So I would say immerse yourself in the fitness industry, follow a lot of people from a lot of different camps, follow the hit guys, follow the noble natties, follow some influencers, follow a lot of competitive bodybuilders. Those guys are not here to create content, they're here to create the best physiques possible, regardless of how much engagement that gets them. Most of them, not all of them, but I would follow a lot of those guys, especially the naturals, and watch, immerse yourself in, try their methods, and just listen to everybody. Give everybody the light of day. See what resonates. The more experience you get personally, the more you can kind of develop like a BS detector, and the more you can realize who is not just eliminating the bad sources, but realizing who knows more than you. So that's very useful. Read people's books too, I would say. I don't have one out, but I do. I'll probably release one at some point. Congrats on 30K. Supination movements, especially preacher curls, hurt my wrist on the inner side, the pinky side. I've tried easy curl bar, straight bar, dumbbells, etc. to no avail. I'm restricted to doing only neutral grip. Any advice would be really helpful. So I would look at your grip. Straight bar is probably not going to be ideal. I would make sure when you're doing an easy bar, make sure you're not in full supination. So you don't want the handle to be like this, angled in your palm like this. That's a mistake a lot of people make, where when it's angled, you're kind of facing up and it's just like this. I'm not going to be able to explain it properly. I'm trying my best. You want it to be like this, so that the kinked handle in the easy bar allows you to then slowly just pronate your hands just a tiny little bit. So that should help. Instead of keeping it flat and just angled and bent in your hands, you want it to be angled up so you can pronate just a little bit more. You should pretty much be fine. This stuff is really hard to give cues on if I can't see your technique, though. That's the tough part. Congrats. If you're using a DSLR, you might want to spend money on dummy battery. It's a battery you plug into the wall for your camera. Yes, I have. I actually do have 3 of them, but the battery life still is brutal on all of them. I've gone through one. This camera doesn't even tell me what my battery life is at now, so I'll probably go through 2 of them just in the duration of filming this. How much your ape index influences your arm size? I'm the same height as yours. My wingspan is just 5'6". Wow. Yeah. It probably plays a decent role. It's hard to say if it would play a major role. It probably doesn't play a small role, but it probably plays a decent role, I would say. It's impossible to say how much, though. I think my arms more or less look like their measurement. And I think if you just have regular arm genetics, then you could achieve the same thing I have. I'm probably a little bit gifted in terms of bicep muscle belly shape and size, and not so much gifted in triceps. So I don't know. You could probably achieve a roughly similar arm to me at some point. I don't know. I really can't expand on that. It's very tricky to say. Do we only need what is enough for progression in terms of volume, or is there genuinely a benefit to doing more beyond that? There could be some benefit to doing more beyond that, but generally, when you're doing enough to make adaptations happen, that's kind of where it starts to cap out, I've found, where you can do more and more if you want for a specific muscle group, but it might not hold you back. But what I'm trying to say is if you're doing 2 or 3 sets of preacher curls for your biceps, you're doing that twice a week, maybe the second day is a little variation, like, you can kind of get all the growth you need to out of 2 or 3 sets. So it's like on paper, if you're like, well, that's 7 sets a week, 6 sets a week for biceps, like, I really don't think, like, I really couldn't get more doing 12 sets a week. Like, it really sounds appealing, and then you're like, all right, well, in practice, it's like, all right, I'm already doing 3 sets of preacher curls all out. My biceps are fried. Like, I could do more, but like, what is this really doing? And that's kind of what it comes down to for me. There could be definitely some benefit in going above, though, because I do think you can gain strength on super low volumes without gaining that much muscle. And I do think that's why I'm not a huge fan of HIIT. So I do prefer like lower to moderate volumes just for the sake of efficiency and leaving more spots open so you can train other muscle groups without like I'd rather see you do like 3 super hard sets for the lats, 3 super hard sets for the traps, and then leave some open spots to get like your rear delts, than doing like 5 for the traps and 5 for the lats, have 40% of that be junk volume, and then not train your rear delts. Like that's where my mind goes when programming. For DB preacher curls, is it more beneficial to pause and relax the bicep fully in the bottom, or just reverse the motion? Beyond preacher curls in general, is it better to pause at the end ranges of movements such as leg extensions and leg curls, etc.? So I'm not a huge fan on pausing, but it is going to be lift dependent and training age dependent. So if you are a beginner and you're still trying to just master your ability to produce force, pausing can make that trickier because you are now adding another piece to the equation. So now you're not just trying to focus on, all right, like let's say I'm benching, I'm just trying to produce as much force as I possibly can. Now you have to like control that weight really hard and then stop. And then you have to go right back into that mindset and then you stop. Versus if you're just touch and go and produce as much force as you can without trying to think about other things simultaneously, I think for beginners, you will usually get more out of touch and go just for that reason. I wouldn't be shocked if someday science does kind of reveal that to be true. I generally have most beginner lifters do a little bit of touch and go with their pressing. I don't like to have them pause. I do have a client that likes to pause his presses, and I'm kind of against it, but I'm also, I wouldn't say I'm against it, like, that's not the right way to put it, but I would say I would be quick to change that to a touch and go. Like, that'd be one of the first things I do in a stall. For something like a preacher curl, if you're very strong and very advanced and you have the skill to control and pause and instantly get back into the concentric without losing your setup and your brace and all that kind of stuff, I think it's fine. I don't think it's necessary. I mean, I built 18-inch arms doing only touch and go. So, yeah, I mean, based on your profile picture, you definitely look pretty advanced. Very massive guy. So I'd say if you are very strong, pausing can potentially help you. But yeah, if that profile picture just like happens to not be you or something, you're a beginner, I would focus more on producing as much force as you possibly can. Pausing, I'm fairly indifferent towards pausing overall. You have two dials, size and aesthetics. They can be dialed up individually from 0 to 100%. However, they both have to add up to 100% together. How are you setting the dials? Feel free to make assumptions. I know this isn't a perfect scenario, and there are other conflating factors. That's kind of a cool question. So, size and aesthetics. I would go... I mean, it's ultimately going to be subjective, but I can answer it in my own mind. So I would say 75% size... No, I'd go 65, what would it be, 35? Yeah, 65, 35, size to aesthetics. I am not someone that wants to be super aesthetic and small. I like to be big. I just want to get as jacked as I can, and I want to have a reasonably good physique while doing that. So I do care about both, probably care a little bit more about size, I would say. How do I overcome stability being a limitation on my lifts? Don't have access to machines or smiths. So it is lift dependent. Some lifts aren't perfectly stable, but are still very stable. So what I would say is for lifts that are like not very stable at all, you can just lift a little bit lighter and focus more on technique. And that's what I would do. So get a little bit more at a less weight. If you have something like a selectorized machine chest press, where there's really not much room for technique deviation as long as your setup's fine, just go heavy. It's more efficient. But if you're doing like a dumbbell press or something, the heavier you go, you can technically handle 10% heavier than what you can handle with good technique. So if you go for that, that's not necessarily ideal. So what I would do is if it's less stable overall, focus more on technique is what I would say. Go a little bit slower, try and get more to less weight. Typical Alex Leonidas advice. I know you're a fan of power shrugs. When should someone consider adding them in? Are shrugs a must for big traps? For big traps, no. You can just get away with rowing variations for sure. If you're talking about like freak of nature, like massive upper traps in particular, I would say power shrugs or shrug variation is going to be necessary. I wouldn't really consider adding them in until you know that your upper traps are a specific weak point. So once you have other like well-developed muscle groups in the traps, if the traps are still lagging behind, then you can add them in. But that's going to be very subjective, and you're going to have an observant eye for that. Any additions to the home gym you're still considering, or do you feel you have everything you need? Do you think people should look at machines or stick to the basics of squat rack and barbell and building a basement gym of their own? So I would love to get more selectorized machines. I am out of space, though. That's the tough part. So, for this gym, no. My next home gym, which will likely be in like a barn or detached garage in 4, 5, 6 years, I will definitely be loading up on selectorized machines. Absolutely. For now, there's really nothing I would need. I have everything that I would want. I have a lengthened bias row machine, I have a Smith machine, I have the squat rack, I have the lever arms, the hammer strength, chest, and lat machine. I have a pull down, pec deck, reverse pec deck, leg press, preacher station, dip station, cable station, easy bar, adjustable dumbbells, decline bench, T-bar row. I have a Cybex selectorized overhead press machine that didn't fit in the bulkhead. What a nightmare. It's just sitting in my backyard. Miss Basement's not happy about that. I would say for home gyms, Smith machine and a half rack is a pretty versatile option. So that way, if you have the half rack, you can still do like rack pulls and barbell movements, and then maybe get like a preacher curl too, and you should pretty much be covered. Single stack cable station is also really good, and that all of that won't take up that much space. And you pretty much should be good. And if you want to save more space, you could even do dumbbell preacher curls on an adjustable bench. I personally prefer regular preacher curls, but if we're talking about saving space at a home gym, yeah, that's fine. If I only have dumbbells, can I still do JM press effectively? If so, how would you program it? So I would do it with body weight, like I mentioned earlier in the Q&A. do a JM press off the floor, off a bar that's racked, or off of a bench. That will do more than a dumbbell JM press simply because the dumbbells will limit your range of motion, which is kind of the benefit of the JM press in the first place. So I would just do them body weight instead of even trying to like makeshift dumbbell them, and you should be fine. Overall, my motivation is slowly declining. Still pretty consistent, but been taking a day off here and there. I want to adopt a more casual mindset towards lifting, where it's okay for me to take a day off my workout schedule if I can't make time for it, or just want a day to myself. The part that I fear is becoming complacent and falling off completely. What would you recommend in my situation? So I wouldn't follow a split that you plan on taking days off from. What I would do is train less often overall. This is what I'm doing myself. I would train full body 3 times a week or even twice a week. And what this does is it gives you more time to yourself. It also gives you more time away from the gym to then potentially make you want to get back in there a little bit more. So I would set genuine goals. I would consider not following the fitness industry as closely. It might feel like a source of motivation, but it also might be overriding your motivation and making you chase goals that you don't really care about. That happened with me in power building back in like 2018, 2019. So what I would do is do some searching on what you actually want. Like, why are you even lifting in the first place? There's a reason for it, and you've probably just forgotten about it or never like truly realized what it was. And once you rediscover that, it will take a little bit of time to shift your mindset. But once you train what you like innately desire, it becomes so much more fun. I would forget about standards. Like, you're always going to get comments of guys saying like, oh, you have to train your legs, you're not a real lifter, just stuff like that. Just forget about it. Like, you're in no position to worry about those kinds of things. So what I would say is consider training less days per week, but still keeping your weekly frequency at 2 times a week per muscle to continue to make progress, or 3 times a week, even if it's indirect, doing like a 3 times a week full body approach where some muscles get hit as a secondary mover and other compound movements. I would also say, I had something. What was it? It just totally blanked my mind. Yeah, set your goals. Think about what you actually want to do. Train less per week. Oh yeah, I was gonna say just find out what you don't like about lifting. Like, there was a point for me recently where I was just lifting too heavy on too many lifts, and my technique was starting to fall apart. And I realized I dreaded every single session, and it was tough to get that balance of lifting lighter but still lifting as hard as I was before. But now that I've kind of found that sweet spot, I enjoy my sessions much, much more now. So figure out what motivates you in a positive way. Figure out what kills your motivation in a negative way. Do what you can to, within reason, negate those things, and you should be good to go. So I hope that helped, because I've been kind of in a similar situation as you before. How would you run a 3-day-a-week program with a heavy emphasis on upper body? I would do full body 3 times a week, and just sprinkle your leg training throughout. I won't be able to go too in depth on that since this is a super long Q&A. Super long question on genetics. I wish I could answer this. I just don't have time to go through it right now, unfortunately. So I do apologize to you. In a future Q&A where I pick less questions, you could try and ask that again. This is going to be like 3 hours. What can you standing barbell curl even with slight cheat form? For a 1 rep max, probably maybe 170 with slight cheat. With a moderate to severe cheat, probably like 190, 185 or something. I can do 135 for like 4 to 6 with pretty strict technique. Which way would you do a Smith jam press in a Smith machine that's angled? Also, any tips for getting forearm splints on every supinated curl? So first, forearm splints, you have to let the current ones that you're dealing with dissipate before going into something else. If you're just rotating and never giving yourself time off to like let them dissipate, then they're going to keep coming back. So if you haven't taken time off, then I would take time off. If you get them on literally everything, I don't know what to tell you. You could try strengthening your forearms through just training like pronation, supination, wrist flexion and extension, finger flexion and extension. You could try that and see if it helps. But it is a tricky one to give advice on when I don't know your program. And for jam press and a Smith machine, I would press up and back. What do you think a beginner should do differently than an intermediate lifter? Additionally, can you elaborate more on probably meant to say why preacher hammer curls are not an effective exercise? So preacher hammer curls are an effective exercise. They're just not quite ideal. So the brachialis will have the most leverage in more flexion. So I would just do a regular hammer curl variation that is mid to short biased. And for your long length stuff, I'd stay supinated and work your biceps a little bit more and put them in a position to have better leverage and keep your wrists in a very strong position with that supination. What do you think a beginner should do differently than an intermediate lifter? Well, there's a lot of things. Let me try and think of some bigger pieces of advice for you. So a beginner should not worry about lagging areas because you don't have any lagging areas, or stubborn areas you just don't know yet. A beginner should have a very heavy emphasis on training precision. So technique and intensity. Don't just focus on one at the expense of the other. Focus on both. You get a lot of beginners that are super hyper fixated on technique and they're worried to train hard. You have to try and get your technique better, but not to the point where you're sacrificing pushing yourself as hard as you possibly can, or just general progressive overload. A beginner should also be focused on keeping up with progressive overload, so adding weight to the bar more frequently because you're making the adaptations that allow for that. You're going to be rapidly gaining size and strength, and if you don't keep your stimulus sufficient, you're going to be training very efficiently, and it's very hard to get. Basically what I'm trying to say is, if you're a beginner and you're not adding weight to your lifts and you're being very conservative with adding weight, your adaptations are going to surpass your rate of progression. And what happens then is that weight becomes so ineffective because you're not an experienced and skilled enough lifter to get more out of less weight. So you have the skill of a beginner lifter, but you're trying to train like an advanced one when beginners don't add weight to the bar. And it leads you to spinning your wheels all the time. So that would be my biggest piece of advice to you. What are all the best lifts where cheating is better than doing the standardization, or than doing the standardized version? So I won't be able to name all of them, but generally short biased pulling movements. You'll see a lot of the top bodybuilders, they use some cheat in their rows. A row by nature, by the internal strength curve, is going to be short biased. So if there isn't an external implement making the resistance profile of the lift itself lengthened biased, that's going to be very tough as you get to that contracted position, and you are exponentially weaker there, and it fatigues first. So using a little bit of cheat to make it harder at the start and easier at the contraction can go a long way, and that's why you see so many jacked bodybuilders using cheat technique with a flat resistance profile lift, and then they always love to do T-bar rows and then cheat reps and all that kind of stuff, and it always is going to favor length and bias. They probably can't explain the reasons of why they're doing that or whatnot, but they just know it feels good. And those top bodybuilders, people can say it's genetics all they want. A lot of them are very, very in tune with how their body works and how things feel, even if they're unable to verbally articulate it. So a lot of those top guys, don't listen to what they say all the time, but watch what they do, because they do things right a lot of the time. Can you rate my split? I can't. I apologize. I just can't go. I don't have the mental capacity right now to give you an actual constructive criticism. So don't take that as me just brushing off your question or whatever. I would love to if I had the mental energy to go more in depth and have high attention to detail. I like to be more precise and articulate when talking about splits and programs than in the middle of a 7-hour Q&A. Can you please talk about injuries? Some people like me have long-term chronic injuries that have developed over years. How can I manage, for example, I can't really do some basic exercise as well. So, same goes for injuries. I'm not going to be able to give you a legit helpful answer unless I was training you. And even then, it's if you have more severe injuries, you're going to want to see a doctor or PT rather than just Somebody like me who deals with like regular like lifting overuse injuries and that kind of stuff. If you're talking about chronic injuries, like I would go to someone that specializes in that for sure. What do you think is the best free weight substitute for Smith machine JM press if one does not have access to a Smith machine but has barbell and dumbbells? Barbell, 100%. If I have 14-inch arms, do you think it's feasible to grow an inch in a month? No, that's way too fast. It's not impossible. Like, I have seen that happen in very rare cases. Maybe not in a month, but in a few months. Absolutely, it is possible, especially if you're gaining weight and like starting to directly train your arms. You get like the swelling going on. You're gaining weight and you're building muscle. You're gaining a little bit of fat. Like, that's possible, but a month, like, come on. Why do you want to have it in a month? What's in a month? Oh, maybe Valentine's Day? I don't know. How do you go about curing golfer's elbow? For me, it's most prominent while my elbow is in isometric strain whilst doing squats or during pulling movements. It disappears when I'm warmed up, but still annoying nonetheless. I would look up direct advice to this. You'll be able to find a more efficient cure to specifically what you're dealing with on the internet and just scrolling through forums. I'm hesitant to answer this kind of stuff in a Q&A, so not to brush off that question. I just, during Q&As, without knowing much aside from a couple minor details, I'm going to have a hard time answering it. I'm also not an expert with injuries, so I would go to someone that is like a physical therapist or a doctor of some sort that specializes in those things, and you should be fine. Any plans to make nutritional content? I'd really like to see what your bulk meal staples are. Yeah, I don't plan on it. I just think nutrition is... I just eat like a regular, healthy bodybuilder. There's nothing... Maybe not like a regular health... I'm not like eating chicken, rice, and broccoli all the time, but I just kind of eat a generic diet. There's nothing special or useful about it. It honestly, like, maybe it is helpful and useful, so maybe I will do it. It's just not a high priority for me personally, and I just like to post stuff that I like to post. But if it's helpful, I'll definitely consider it at some point. Any plans? No, same question. I think we get a little tired here. Is there anything wrong with just one exercise per muscle? Preacher curl for biceps, overhead extension for long head, vertical pulls for lats, barbell or forbidden traps, and erectors? Not necessarily, but the problem you'll run into is that to gain muscle at an optimal rate, you're going to want to be training it twice a week. And if you're training it twice a week, you might as well do variations. So what I would do is just do variations. You'll get better gains this way anyways because you train different resistance profiles. You can train different regions, different functions of that same muscle. So in theory, you could repeat the same lifts over and over, but it will get kind of monotonous. You're more prone to developing bad habits. And it's fine in some cases, but I wouldn't do it across the board. You're going to have subpar gains too because your muscles have more functions and regions than something that one lift can cover for everything. Have you ever had issues with forearm pain, brachialis muscle in particular, after performing preacher curls? Have you had to adjust form? Not really. That's going to be, again, very individual. You mentioned in one video you don't track protein or calories. I find tracking every meal in the day quite mentally taxing and difficult, so this interests me. How do you ensure you're eating enough to be in a small surplus? When I intuitively eat, I don't gain weight. The key is going to be to track the scale. You have to keep a close eye on how your weight gain trends are going, and that will kind of confirm that your eating habits are going in the right direction. If you happen to like be at maintenance or just below on a couple days throughout the week, but the other days make up for it, as long as you're generally in a surplus throughout the week, you're fine. As long as you're hitting your weight gain goals, you're fine, man. I wouldn't overthink it. I really wouldn't, unless you're super lean. Like if you're under 15% body fat or you're like a competitive bodybuilder, I wouldn't sweat it. I really do think it's overrated. I found that 3 sets per exercise was too difficult to recover from as I'm 41 years old. I started doing 2 sets mainly in the 8 to 12 range, going to failure in the first set and only progressing when I can hit 12 reps. My second set rarely can match the first set performance. For compounds, I stay in the 6 to 8 range. Same double progression, 3 days a week full body. In your opinion, is this high intensity training? How do you recommend increasing volume? No, that's not HIT. Did you mention your frequency? 3 days a week full body. Yeah, no, that's a totally reasonable split. Yeah, I mean, if you're training 3 times a week, 2 sets a session is like... That's like reasonable. That's like average. Yeah, that's totally fine. That's not HIT. HIT would be like once a week, one set or something. That's, yeah, you're totally fine. People act like that's low volume, but it's really not. I get forearm pain during preacher curls. My curl bar feels like stress in the bone underneath. Can't push through it anymore. Dumbbells don't let me lift as heavy, probably due to stability. I train at home and can't afford a preacher curl machine. How do I fix this without losing gains? Rotate variations. I would go to something where you are not using a fixed bar, so something that is bilateral, but it doesn't have to be bilateral, but it can be. What I'm saying is it doesn't necessarily have to be unilateral. Just make sure the sides aren't attached. So whether that's like a Bayesian curl, a standing bilateral separate handle cable curl, dumbbell curl, alternating dumbbell curl, those are all going to be totally fine. Check out my video. It was one of my Road to 18-inch arm series. I can't remember exactly what it was titled, but it was something along the lines of when to deload, devolume, or like take time off or something. So if you type in basement bodybuilding, deload, devolume, that Road to 18-inch arms episode explains all of that. So what I would do as a quick suggestion, if you don't want to watch that whole video, take 2 to 4 weeks at a rotation of a lift that I mentioned that falls under that criteria, and you should be fine. If you are having a severe case and you're very strong, take an extra week. Go up to 4 weeks of a different variation. If you're a little bit like weaker, generally speaking, it's obviously a very vague thing that I just said, but if you're not particularly strong and you are the forearm splints are kind of new to you, you could probably get away with 2 weeks, but don't be afraid to take an extra week. It will help you out a ton in the long term, I would say. What do you think of arm blasters? I'm doing single arm preacher curls on my incline bench, and I'm not sure I want to dedicate the space for a preacher curl in my home gym. I don't see many noble daddies using them. So arm blasters are fine, but it's very much different than a preacher curl. It has very similar-ish stability to a certain point, and then it gets tricky because you're just standing up. But the resistance profile is going to be very different. So they're okay, I would say, but I would rather just do like a single arm cable curl where my arm is where my elbow is braced up on the cable post, kind of like this, if that makes sense. If you've seen the Road to 18-inch arms, you've probably seen me do those. Advice for 6'4" tall lifters with a 6'4" wingspan and arms, please help. So what I would do is focus on your extremities, especially on the upper body. Like, get your arms big. They're going to take a long time to fill out, but they have a ton of potential. Your measurements can be freaking massive. What I would do is you probably have fairly wide shoulders if you're that tall. So what you want to do is just add detail and think about making like lumps of muscle around your entire physique. So you want to have big upper traps. Your chest isn't the most 3D muscle, so don't worry about that too much, but you want to have big traps that create separation rather than just like kind of like a thin, skinny like collarbone sticking out. So get some big traps. Grow your delts, especially the rear delts. Since you're taller, you're going to look a little bit narrower from the side, so get big rear delts to add a little bit of thickness and some 3D look. Side delts are going to be huge. Grow your arms as much as you can. There's really nothing to focus on a whole ton, but the lateral head of the tricep will add detail to what would otherwise be kind of like a longer humerus. So lateral head of the tricep helps a ton, and other than that, you pretty much should be good. Train everything else like you normally would. Having bigger legs can make you more proportional too. If you have very long legs and you're tall, having bigger legs can be a pretty cool look, I think. At what age would I no longer be able to make gains? Currently 24, and I just want to know how long I can keep this going. So that's more training age dependent than biological age dependent. So if you're 24 and let's say you are 10 years into, or like 8 years into lifting, and you're like a late intermediate, you'll probably stop making gains when you're like, well, I don't think you would stop making gains entirely probably by the time you're like 40, in most cases. Like, that would be my rough guess. I do still think you could progress very strongly on a lot of lifts until you're in your mid-30s. It would be slow progress, but it would be progress nonetheless. But it's much more of a training age thing. Like, if someone's 35 and they just start lifting, they're going to be making gains until they're like late 40s. But if someone is maxed out when they're 25, they'll probably start to lose progress by the time they're like 40 or so. So that's where it gets a little bit tricky. It varies per person, but yeah, that's it's situation dependent on that one, so it's hard to give an exact answer. Is it okay? But if you're 24, like, bro, they're super young. Don't worry about it. Is it okay to lower volume for legs, 6 to 8 sets max for quads and hips each, to focus on upper body even if I don't have impressive legs? Will I progress on that? Yeah. If you're saying 6 to 8 sets a week, I mean, you'll still grow very, like, you can nearly maximize growth doing that. So yeah, that will just help you grow your upper body because now you're eliminating junk volume. And it is okay to train the way you want. If you don't want huge legs, that's totally fine. Totally fine. Is full body twice a week good for either bulking or cutting? Thanks for the awesome content. Absolutely. Do you think that YouTube fitness in general focuses too much on the details of lifting, and that the hyper focus on those details is responsible for people struggling to make gains, or is it another factor? No, I think a lot of channels lack an all-encompassing video or series on how to make gains. So if you take like the general content that something like Renaissance Periodization posts, it's, is there a benefit to training more than 3 times a week? Or super time-efficient arm workout? Or what are my thoughts on science-based lifting? Or like, I'm even just going to, oh no, then I'm going to lose all these questions. But no, I'm curious. I'm just going to pull up like what their recent videos are. I can barely type. My hands are so numb. So Renaissance Periodization, like one of the go-to channels. And this isn't me like just talking down about them, because I do think they have a lot of good content. As much as I might disagree with some of their more recent stuff, and as much as everyone kind of unanimously agrees with that, this is the problem. If you're a new lifter and you go to the most reputable, biggest YouTube fitness channel and you scroll through, these are the titles. The most effective chest, back, and arm workout. Cool. 30 minutes on the thumbnail. Like, yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't want to be watching that. Exercise scientist critiques Alex Hormozy's $100 million workout. Is your diet actually working? Here's how, or here's why. Training to failure might cause more growth than we thought. Does perfect form really build more muscle? Like, it's focusing on very specific variables without taking the context into approach. So you get beginners that don't understand the context of training, and that's the problem. There's nothing wrong with focusing on the details. I think it's very important, but you have to understand training as a whole and the philosophy of lifting, and have a fundamentally sound lifting philosophy that you understand and truly believe in practice for those details to then be able to actually refine your approach to lifting. But if you're just clueless about lifting and all you know is like frequency is important, then what are you going to do with that? Like, there's no context to add that knowledge to. And there's no base core philosophy that you have in your head to like put that up against and like see how it works or see how it doesn't. So that's the problem. I absolutely love the finer details of training. So it's I think people just lack a comprehensive understanding of how lifting works as a whole. All right, let's see if I can find where I left off. Let's see. Here we go. How do you adjust your diet when you aren't counting calories? I eat the same thing every day, more or less, so I just eat more or less. Do you do cardio? Yes, I'm a hockey player. What do you think about diets such as carnivore diet or keto? And when I say I'm a hockey, I'm not like I just play in men's league. I'm not like an actual hockey player. What do you think about diets such as carnivore diet or keto? Do you ever see yourself trying? No, definitely not. Diets like that eliminate foods falter when you say, why are you excluding like fruit or vegetables? Like that's like my instant thoughts. Like, if someone's like, oh, I'm going to do carnivore, I'm like, why aren't you going to eat like fruit and vegetables? And there's like, how do you argue that? I just don't get it. So no, I just eat a normal healthy diet. Like it always comes back to just eating generally healthy whole foods. Like that's always what it comes down to. Limiting saturated and trans fats, getting your micronutrients in, getting your protein in, and you're good. How to train triceps and hamstrings at home? Totally depends on the equipment you have, dude. That's going to be tough for me to answer without knowing. Do you have to wait 48 hours for a muscle to recover? Yes, I would. I wouldn't train the same muscle on back-to-back days. I would not do that. He gives a scenario, but I won't go through all of that right now. But yeah, I would take a day for sure. Do you think Koth Blahino uses fake weights, and that's why his lifts at home are far better than his meet lifts, or do you think that he just doesn't know how to program to peak for meets? I can provide numbers if you actually decide to answer this question. It's a pretty big difference between the lifts, though. I mean, it's possible. It really is possible. I have no idea. I think he's on a bunch of gear, so he's probably pretty strong. But I don't I don't follow along. Are people's expectations of what they can achieve unreasonable? I always thought I'd have reached bigger numbers after 6 years of hard training. Some people's are, yes. I think the people that are hyper-fixated on, or not hyper-fixated, but I think the people that are very fixated on training age having a perfect correlation to training advancement, that can be a reality check. Definitely. Absolutely it can be. So I think the vast majority of people, like if you go to like the Natty or Juice Reddit page or something like that, those people have no expectations. Anybody that's like an you take like a semi-lean intermediate lifter and put him in good lighting, they think he's a fake natty. So that's a problem. If you even mention like a natural bodybuilding competition, they're like, haha, natural. Yeah, right, the drug testing doesn't work. I would say, don't focus so much on training age. It matters, but training at the level of advancement that you are matters much more than your like number of years put into the gym. Because if you have been training for 6 years, but your first 2 years were just noob gains, the next 2 years were just faulty methods, or you were inconsistent, it's like what is your training age really? And that's where it gets a little bit tricky. So you might have the experience and the knowledge to continue to make really good gains, but you might not quite be there yet. It might take you till year 8. I would also say, as far as expectations go, it's tough because there's not a whole ton of serious lifters naturally in real life. There's usually going to be about one per commercial gym. Like I rarely meet other serious natural lifters like myself in commercial gyms. I've been to a million of them. But what I would say is, if you're comparing yourself in a relaxed state with no pump and not good lighting without proper posing to like the fitness influencer that has the perfect posing, the perfect camera, the perfect lighting, you just have to compare yourself under similar circumstances. So if you see somebody like myself or another noble natty in a relaxed state without a pump, without flexing, without all that kind of stuff, compare yourself to that, and then compare yourself to that training age and that level of advancement. You can kind of see how you are relative to that. And if you want to compare yourself to someone like me or the other noble natties when we're like posing or have a pump or in good lighting or whatever, taking a picture in the mirror instead, you can compare yourself to that, but make sure you're under that same circumstance, because then it's an honest comparison. I have no balls to do preacher curls. Help. Just have to start doing them. Start light, slowly add weight, let your bicep tendons adapt, and you'll be heavy and strong before you know it. At what point do you end your bulk cycles? When I can comfortably and when I can detect progress in a recomp at peak bulk for multiple weeks strung together. That's when I end the bulk. If my progress is stalling out once I start to eat at maintenance, then I'll continue to bulk. But once you've bulked up to peak bulk multiple times, kind of a tongue twister there, you can kind of have an idea of what your preferred peak bulk is, whether it's like a body weight range or a waist size or something like that. Do you think it's possible to build 17 to 18 inch arms using arm exercises, only using arm exercises without compounds? Absolutely. Absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Are there any other solo sports or physical activities that you want to progress on in the future? For example, running, jumping, rock climbing, Olympic lifting. Big fan of your channel. Appreciate that, man. So, solo sports, I'm really not that big on. I much prefer team sports, specifically hockey. That's like easily my favorite sport as far as like the actual practice of it goes. I like it more than anything. As far as other solo sports, the only thing I could see myself getting into would be arm wrestling. Maybe regular wrestling. If preacher curls are my primary bicep builder, what other bicep exercises would you recommend to complement it? Well, something more short biased. So you could do like a cable curl, an regular easy bar curl. You could do like a single arm strict cable or dumbbell curl. That should be totally fine. I understand the importance and appeal for building muscle, getting jacked, etc. But can you see yourself shifting focus and try to actually become stronger as a main goal? So no, getting stronger is always going to be a byproduct, and I am very, very strong, but it will never be my main goal because then I lose interest in my training and I forget why I even started doing it in the first place. Getting stronger is, if I'm getting stronger at the expense of the stimulus I'm generating in a set, then I don't enjoy that. So I wouldn't do it because like I said in actually the last question, I don't really enjoy solo sports like that. So like being a powerlifter or strongman, like it really doesn't appeal to me at all. Like for actual like physical performance things, like it's hockey. I love sports that involve like quick decision making and not just like training something and then testing it. I love hockey where you can. It's dependent on instant feedback and decision making right then and there. I think that's fun. And it's much more like fast paced. Like I'm a goalie. I love getting pucks shot at me and trying to catch them, and it's exciting and it's fun, and you have so much pressure on you too because you can kind of let the whole team down with one mistake. What's your opinion on prisoner style workouts? They're great for calisthenics, but I'd say as far as bodybuilding goals, I can't speak. This is when I talk. This is what happens when I talk for 3 hours straight. As far as bodybuilding goes, you're going to want to stick to more stable stuff, machines with good progression potential. Is there some ratio for progression between pulling and pushing movements? Pushing movements I seem to progress so slow, but on the other hand, pulling in the other hand, progress is fine. So presses are going to progress. If your presses are progressing slower than anything else, it just means that you are probably using cheat technique more than you realize. You can't cheat on your presses. They're honest, they're length and biased, and they're highly stable. So when you add a rep to your presses, assuming your technique and your setup are relatively similar, that's honest, true progression. So when you're doing something like a pull-up or a row, you can cheat in so many tiny little undetectable ways that give you much more rapid performance progression, that is. So that's generally why it's the case. If your pressing muscles are just all lagging as a whole, like your chest and your delts and your quads, then you might just not be training them properly, but I'm more inclined to suggest it's the former on this one. How to get jacked on 3 sessions a week without involving full body training. Life happens, but I still want to keep the train rolling. So I would do full body. The thing that people don't like about full body is they feel like they have to, or the thing that deters people from full body, and this is what's deterred me in the past, is feeling like you have to train every region, every function of every muscle on your entire body every session. That is not the way to go about it. So like I explained earlier in the Q&A, what you want to do is find ways to sneak. You want to train like 2/3 of your body on every session. You want to find ways to sneak other muscle groups in other sessions so you can keep that stimulus going and prevent atrophy, even if it's not an ideal stimulus. So an example I'll give here is if you are training your hamstrings. Let's say you do a deadlift, like a stiff leg deadlift or an RDL on Monday. And then on Wednesday, you're like, all right, well, I'm not going to do another deadlift or something. What if you do like a bent over barbell row? That will still train your hamstrings. It's not going to give them an optimal stimulus, but it's not going to let them atrophy or detrain or anything. So it keeps the ball rolling, and it keeps those adaptations there. And then on Friday, maybe you can do something like a hamstring curl, or maybe you do like another bent over row or something. And now instead of just training the hamstrings once a week on that Monday session, you can then keep the ball rolling with some indirect work or another variation or something like that. So there's other ways you can kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone, and you just have to get creative with it. Tips on minimizing chest gaps beyond just growing chest. Any way to draw attention away from the gaps? So not really. Not really. You're just gonna have to get big and jacked, and maybe developing your abs could help, and your traps. When you have super big traps, it kind of draws attention away from the pecs. It adds more mass to your overall body. That's a muscle that you can quite literally just like turn from, instead of just being a back muscle, it can then become a front muscle when your upper traps get super big. Developed abs will just give more texture to everything. A bigger pecs will obviously help, as you already said, and that would be my suggestion. When are you going to commit to the unthinkable science-based lifting sin and try a bro split? I don't think I would ever try a bro split, unfortunately. I have a very hard time progressing on low frequency. And final question. Funny enough, it's all coming full circle here. I believe I've heard you mention a small channel called Profit Fear. He's doing some wacky but interesting stuff. Do you have any further thoughts on his training and exercise selection? Thanks. So, yeah, he's more extremist with his training and his exercise selection and his technique. It is not something that the majority of people are going to be able to execute properly, especially if they're self-coached. He knows his stuff with biomechanics, that's for sure. And that's kind of the extent of my thoughts. We have interesting conversations on the Instagram DMs, and I like his stuff, and I really like the way he approaches his training. I don't like to train that way because I think it's a little bit too extreme. I'm not a full ROM guy, but I like a generally bigger ROM. I like to go through peak resistance and try and train muscles generally either length and biased or where they have best leverage. Like, that's how I like to train. So it's a little bit more conventional, well, a lot more conventional than him. But yeah, I like what he's doing, and I like the emphasis on kind of questioning and breaking the norm, and not just doing it for the sake of being rebellious, but also explaining why, like, the regular suggestions are also kind of they don't really have a solid foundation. So, with all that said, this Q&A is actually over. I can't believe it. If you watched all the way through, I genuinely appreciate you a ton. It means a lot, and I'm glad that you come here for bodybuilding talk. So, thanks everybody for 30K, and I'll see you guys in the next one.